Good morning. My name is Lisa Hamilton, and as the director of the Forum on Global Violence Prevention at the National Academies, I would like to start the workshop by introducing the amazing co-chairs of this planning committee. Emmy Betts, who is an associate professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She's also the director of the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative and research physician at Eastern Colorado Geriatric Research, Education, and Clinical Center for Veterans Health. We also have as a co-chair, Corinne Picasa, who is a professor of occupational and environmental health. She is also director of the University of Iowa Injury Prevention Research Center and director of the International Collaborative Trauma and Injury Training Program in Central Europe. Please welcome them.
Thank you, Lisa. This is Corinne, and on behalf of Emmy and myself, I am delighted to invite our amazing lineup of speakers, our audience members. Thank you so much for joining in for our conversation, and for our forum members.
This workshop is a product of the Forum on Global Violence Prevention within the Health and Medicine Division of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. The Global Violence Prevention Forum aims to facilitate dialogue and exchange by bringing together experts of the forum to reduce the burden of violence and promote healthy development of individuals and communities. The forum really opens up potential for prevention in all parts of the world.
We would first like to acknowledge our other planning committee members who helped put this workshop together. These include Stephanie Alexander, who is a health scientist at the Office on Women's Health at the National Institutes of Health; Sheldon Greenberg, who is Professor of Management and Leadership at Johns Hopkins School of Education; Heidi Carr, who is the lead of the Violence and Trauma team within the Health Practice Promotion and Innovation Portfolio at the Education Development Center; Elizabeth Petroy, who is Program Specialist in the Office of Elder Justice and Adult Protective at the U.S. Department of Health Services; Steve Terrett, who is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Health Policy and Management, Emergency Medicine, and Pediatrics at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine; and Polly Weissner, who is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Utah and Arizona State University. We would also like to acknowledge and thank our supportive and wonderful Global Violence Prevention Forum co-chairs, Hortensia Amaro, who is Distinguished University Professor and Senior Scholar of Community Health at Wardine College of Medicine and Stemple College of Public Health and Social Work at Florida International University; and James Mercy, who is the Director of the Division of Violence Prevention at the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
So day one of this three-day workshop will focus on how fear of violence affects a person's biology, the difference between fear and threat, and how fears may be accurately or inaccurately perceived and promoted through culture in the media. We'll also focus on what the consequences are for inaccurately perceiving and promulgating threats.
As we move into day two, we'll focus on prevalent forms of fear of violence and also look at individual and interpersonal intervention frameworks for building resilience in the face of these fears and how to arrest the cycle of violence that may be their consequence. On day three of the workshop, we'll look at macro and community level interventions that address fear of violence in vulnerable populations across the lifespan and through threat resilience frameworks.
So we hope that you as the audience will participate by using the Q&A function to ask speakers questions during our moderated discussion sessions. You can feel free to put those questions in at any point during the presentations, and then we hope we'll be able to address them. The forum members are also invited to ask their questions during the discussion sessions, either through the chat box or by coming onto the Zoom screen. And now let's get started. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Laura Rogers is the acting director of the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice. Ms. Rogers is an attorney with a very distinguished career in the prosecution of and prevention of family violence. Ms. Rogers?
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you to the National Academies and the committee co-chairs, Dr. Betts and Dr. Picasa, for convening this very important and timely discussion on how violence and fear of violence affect our communities and ourselves down to even the molecular level. I head up the U.S. Justice Department on Violence Against Women, which has awarded nearly $9 billion in grants over 20 years, all of which aim to improve the response to domestic and sexual violence. My office serves as a leading voice within the federal government on these crimes. We are committed to serving victims and holding offenders accountable through grants we issue under programs authorized by the Violence Against Women's Act, or VAWA, through our policy efforts. I am delighted to share a bit about the work that we do with you today. I also want to share with you some of my experiences with fear so that you can consider one point of view from within the criminal justice system as you do your work this week. I was a prosecutor before joining the Department of Justice to direct grant-making offices. I made my career specializing in the prosecution of child sexual abuse, child homicide, domestic violence and homicide, and sexual assault cases. So I have seen up close and personal the havoc that these crimes wreak. I know the palpable fear they instill in victims and their families, and I have seen the way abusers use the fear that they create to control the victims and keep them quiet. I'm not going to cite volumes of research chronicling the long-term abuse, adverse impacts of these forms of violence on victims' physical and psychological health. Many of you attending this workshop are the experts on these topics. But what I can talk to you about is what I have seen from every vantage point that my professional life has afforded me, and how the trauma of these crimes endure long after the cuts and the bruises heal. Tragically, the trauma can also be passed down through generations, as the effect of witnessing domestic violence leave children with scars that can affect their development and the entire course of their lives. As a prosecutor in San Diego, California, I bore witness to horrific crimes and the worst depravity outside of a war zone that humans inflict on each other. I saw brutal sexual homicides and child murders that destroyed families and gripped communities with fear. I applaud you for the work you are undertaking this week, because to have fear is to be human. And yet we cannot let our fears keep us from going about our daily lives. We must work to better our understanding of fear and what they are telling us to make the world a better place and a safer place. There is a lot of criticism today of what we pay and the people that dedicate their lives to serve and protect us. So I want to start by acknowledging the sacrifices made by people on the front lines, police and other first responders, who routinely push through their own personal fears to help people at their worst moments and at the most times. Whether it is the paramedics who are those people who are infected with COVID, or police officers who are facing domestic abusers with a gun. These people face their own fears on the job. I also want to share with you some frightening and real stories of what I call real-life monsters that I've encountered. I want to share some of the stories of my experiences so that you begin your work. As you begin your work, you know that these are not just the stuff of crime documentaries or podcasts. I have to admit that these work experiences have shaped the fear in my life. My husband thinks that I'm a little overboard when it comes to fear, or the amount of fear that I have with respect to protecting our children. But our fears are shaped by our life experience. I remember when we took our brood of kids, we have 4, to an amusement park, and I demanded that we have mandatory buddies with one parent in the middle of the kids, and no one got to go to the bathroom alone. I even made sure that my cell phone number was written on everyone's arm with a Sharpie pen. Yes, a Sharpie pen. Now, my husband will tell you that I see a child molester behind every lamppost and tree, but I would tell you that I have what I think is a healthy fear for the safety of my kids every day. But on that day, being the mom who does things probably a little differently helped protect my kids from a child molester that we later learned was in the park and was actually molesting the kids in the crowd as he walked behind them. My fears and precautions kept our kids safe that day. And I'm aware that my mother's intuition is a little bit skewed by my work as a prosecutor, and I'm going to share a bit more with you on that. But before I do, I need to provide a disclaimer. Whenever we start talking in details about our work at OVW, we pause to acknowledge that the details of what we're going to be discussing can be hard to hear, especially for trauma survivors. And I want to offer that for your awareness here before I go on, because I'm going to share some details that I think may be relevant to your work this week. The stories may stoke your own fear. As a prosecutor in San Diego, I responded to and prosecuted cases of horrific crimes. I remember rolling out to one crime scene where two young boys, ages 9 and 13, had been brutally murdered after being sexually assaulted. It was one of those scenes where your understanding of humanity comes into question. In this case, the boys had been hung after being sodomized, forced to orally copulate their perpetrator, and tortured. This perpetrator, who had previously been convicted in another court for rape, was convicted and received the death penalty for these murders. He recently died in prison as a result of COVID. Another case that I remember well, as it was on the eve of my bridal shower, instead of sleeping, I spent that night investigating a horrific murder of a 6-year-old girl. I spent the night listening to how she'd been taken away from her parents and given to her aunt and uncle and 6 cousins. She was found drowned in the family bathtub that night, which I ended up seeing as almost a kind end to her suffering she had endured in her short life. In the 6 months that she had lived with that family, our investigation revealed that she never saw her cousins in the 2-bedroom apartment in which they lived. She spent her time in the master bedroom closet, starved, beaten, burned with a hairdryer, among other unique forms of torture. She was hanged by her bound wrists from a meat hook. Her bloodied footprints on the walls of the closet revealed how she tried to leverage her weight against the walls to take the pressure off her tired arms. I share these stories with you because I think as you set out on your work this week, it's important that you not forget that there are people in this world who we should all fear. Our ability to discern the fear that we feel when our institutions tell us that something may be dangerous is key to our safety and our survival. At amusement parks or in our own homes. We see this from many angles in our work at the Office on Violence Against Women. Fear plays an important role in putting an end to dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Calls for help are either made or they're not made based on a victim's level of fear. Stalking is either a crime or not a crime based on whether or not a victim feels fear or is afraid. Prosecutions are either successful or not, depending on a victim's level of fear. I recall the countless men who strangled and beat their wives, girlfriends, or boyfriends while terrified children hid under tables or blankets, hoping that they were not next. Desperate calls to police were made amid fear that is palpable when you listen to the 911 calls. Accurate reports of beating were given to the police, but later these women or men would appear in my office to discuss what had happened so I could prosecute their offenders, and another type of fear would take hold. Suddenly, they were telling me a story about accidentally running into a doorknob or accidentally falling down a flight of stairs and denying the history of abuse they had provided to the dedicated police officer who sat patiently next to her or him in my office, often on their day off after working a night shift. We understood the fear the victim felt in that moment of truth. Victims sometimes refuse to talk about their attack out of fear of another beating, fear of their bed partner, fear of losing their support system or their children, or for any other of the many reasons because they were in that cycle of violence. The fear that domestic violence victims live with reflects a threat of safety that extends to others. Many mass shooters have histories of domestic violence, and the most common mass shootings are those involving domestic abusers who kill their own family members. It makes me wonder, just as an aside, I wonder how many of you have that twinge of fear in your stomach as you drop off your kids to the bus stop, wondering if that outside possibility will ever occur at your child's school. Will there be a mass shooting at your child's school? Could it really happen at your child's school in your community? Is there a person like that in your community? I remember the day it happened in San Diego at my coworker, another DA in my office's school. The agonizing fear of her waiting to hear, did her child make it out of the school? And upon learning that her child made it out, the agonizing fear of finding out whose children didn't make it out of the school. Police officers know the danger of domestic abuse with a gun, and yet they push through their fear to rush in to save others, those perfect strangers they have sworn to protect in those situations. Domestic violence calls are among the most dangerous calls our police officers respond to every day. Too many police officers' families have suffered the ultimate sacrifice because of those courageous attempts to save others. Just recently, we heard about Brianna Leith, a young officer from a law enforcement family who was shot and killed responding to a domestic violence call in Indianapolis. And Greg Carnicle, a police commander in Phoenix who was just months away from retirement, was killed responding to a domestic dispute. I remember on my first ride along as a young DA, I was in a cruiser with two sergeants when they got a call of a shotgun blast to the face, a domestic violence shooting. We sped to the scene. The sergeants locked me in the car and told me to stay put as they raced into the house. I was terrified, not thinking twice about their safety. They raced in. This also makes me think back to one of my first office mates at the district attorney's office, a new DA who had gone to law school after leaving the police force after he had been shot multiple times on the job. He came to work in our office with a bullet still lodged next to his spine. He was a great guy, husband, dad, an outstanding prosecutor who died soon after he became a prosecutor as a result of complications from the bullet left in his body. While there are plenty of examples of sensationalized crimes and overblown fears, the reality when it comes to gender-based violence is that fear, in addition to power and control, is often a primary tool used by a perpetrator to manipulate their victim. As I said before, fear of losing a place to sleep and food to eat keeps many people trapped, especially victims of human trafficking. There is also fear of being believed when public perception around these crimes tends to minimize the seriousness and cast doubt on victims' claims. Justice Department data shows that sexual assault is the most unreported violent crime, and many domestic violence victims suffer in silence, only calling the police or fleeing to a shelter when their fears escalate to the point that they don't see any other option. We know that fear of being treated as complicit in one's own victimization, fear of being blamed, fear of retaliation or humiliation, fear of escalating an abuser's rage, fear of losing one's livelihood and resources to care for one's children fuels low rates of reporting. And along those same lines, we know that when crime stats on sexual assault increase, it is most likely reflects an uptick in reported rapes, rather than telling us anything about actual incidents. It may mean that more victims decide that the risk they bear in disclosing their victimization, that confronting the fear and shame that shrouds these crimes is worth it for whatever measure of safety and justice the legal system can afford them. This is why at OVW, our programming aims to ensure that when victims reach out for help, whether they call 911 or a hotline, disclose to a nurse, or confide in a faith leader, what happens next recognizes that they're suffering and supports their recovery. This is why we invest in training and community education alongside victim services and justice solutions. By training hundreds of thousands of people each year, our grantees ensure that justice professionals, law enforcement, advocates, educators, and others equipped to respond competently and compassionately when a victim requests their assistance. Part of that training involves understanding the dynamics of domestic and sexual violence and the reasons victims are often reluctant to seek help. Understanding how fear operates in violent relationships is critical because as ambiguous as the concept of fear might seem, it plays a role in how the justice system handles gender-based violence. Fear matters for determining whether something is grounds for legal action. When petitioning for a protection order from the court, a victim typically must demonstrate fear that is both reasonable and ongoing. Professionals funded through grants from my office assist victims in securing more than 200,000 protection orders annually, which can deter further abuse and increase victims' sense of safety. Criminal laws around stalking also hinge on the level of fear the victim experiences as a result of the stalker's actions. Something that may seem benign when taken out of context, like sending flowers to the victim at her workplace, can actually be part of a pattern of behavior designed to stoke terror in the victim. Indeed, a Department of Justice survey found that of stalking victims who were employed, about 13% missed work at some point due to fear for their safety. And research indicates that fear is correlated with both the incident and severity of post-traumatic stress disorder among domestic violence victims. This is troubling when you consider that, according to CDC figures, nearly 18% of women who suffer domestic violence or sexual violence during their lifetime also report experiencing fear related to their victimization. Fortunately, the Violence Against Women Act has created tools to combat these crimes. VAWA fills resource gaps at the state and local levels and supports coordinated solutions whereby police, prosecutors, victim advocates, healthcare providers, and others work in tandem to best meet victims' needs and bring perpetrators to justice. Victim advocacy, which often involves safety planning with victims, accompanying victims for court proceedings, and connecting victims to resources, may alleviate psychological distress, reduce fear, and improve victims' well-being. Our grantees serve over 400,000 victims and answer more than 1 million hotline calls every year. OVW grantees provide over 2 million housing bed nights to victims and their children each year. 9 out of 10 victims leaving a transitional housing program funded shelter report perceiving a lower risk of violence, and their majority of victims exit to permanent housing of their choice. And innovations in criminal and civil justice systems over the past 2 decades have included the establishment of specialized units, specialized courts and dockets, and system-based advocates who work out of law enforcement agencies and prosecutors' offices to make the justice process navigable for victims. Sexual assault nurse examiner programs have expanded using our grant funds, ensuring that victims can receive medical treatment and have evidence collected from their bodies in the critical hours following a sexual assault. And the Family Justice Center model has been replicated across the country, serving as a one-stop shop for vulnerable families who might otherwise get lost in the shuffle and not get the help they need. We have also prioritized funding for domestic violence homicide prevention strategies Later in this workshop, you'll hear from an eminent pioneer in this area, Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. Through the work that Dr. Campbell and others have done, we now have tools to gauge the level of lethality in an abusive relationship, and the response to victims can then be calibrated to the risk level she or he faces. And I should note that a victim's fear, measuring it and taking it seriously is a critical feature of these tools. Later this year, we will have the findings of an evaluation of our domestic violence homicide prevention initiative. And one of the many things that the study is looking at is victims' fear before and after receiving assistance from police advocates. The impact of these various approaches is borne out in grantees' accounts of how OVW funds are making a difference. One grantee recently shared with us that because of improved partnerships, updated policies and protocols, and use of best practices to ensure the good work is sustained, community partners are now able to have difficult conversations with one another and strategies to come up with solutions. Law enforcement officers are now comfortable working with advocacy groups, even when they don't have enough probable cause to make an arrest, but are still concerned about the environment in a particular home. Overall, they said law enforcement has a better understanding of the dynamics of domestic violence, its impact, and the need for thorough investigations. They made the point that the impact was particularly helpful in response to strangulation, and I want to take just a moment to share with you the importance of taking action in strangulation cases. This is another example of where appropriate reaction to fear enhances survival. Strangulation in an assault is often a precursor to homicide. As I wrap up, I ask that you consider one of the most high-profile cases that our grant funds has helped to support, the prosecution of Larry Nassar, the former U.S. gymnastics doctor who sexually abused hundreds of young women. Grants funds supported the provisions of victim advocacy for the courageous survivors who helped prosecutors build this case. It's my hope that the work you do this week will help us understand better as society has to navigate fear to enable more people to seek help from the men and women who work for justice to make the world a safer place for our children and their kids. Most of our success stories are not front page material. They involve careful building professional relationships, honestly assessing what is and isn't working and making changes from there and taking incremental steps toward a better community response. They involve good old-fashioned police work, de-escalating tense situations, building rapport with a victim and listening to the victim tell her or his story at their own pace, canvassing neighborhoods, interviewing witnesses, and tons of paperwork. I want to close my remarks with a thought about our brave law enforcement officers who push through their own fear to protect us. We've seen too many examples of police betraying their oath and not being held to account for that betrayal. But every day across the nation, thousands of police officers put on their uniform and go to work to protect and serve, putting themselves in harm's way when it's necessary. Police cannot undo the harm by violent offenders, and the justice system alone cannot make a person whole again after their trauma. But every day, in every state, there are people who are striving to make their communities safer and are doing the hard and unglamorous work of trying to prevent future violence and breaking the cycle of violence. They are certainly making us at OVW proud. Thank you and have a great conference.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. That was a wonderful, broad introduction to the fear and how it affects many, many aspects of violence. And I think it's a great number of seeds for us to grow our conversation. Especially thank you for your stories, because they are so important to motivate us and also help us understand so many of the deeper issues related to our topic. So our first session will focus on how fear of violence affects biology. So we have an underlying understanding as we move into how that biological impact leads to complicated outcomes. I will introduce our speakers. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to speak, and then we'll have about a 20-minute question and answer session. So you can submit questions through the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen, and Lisa's going to help us look at those as Emmy and I will to find some questions. And we also have some that the forum organizers have put together. So our first speaker is Rachel Yehuda, who is Director of the Traumatic Stress Studies Division at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Next will be Joseph Ledoux, who is University Professor and Henry and Lucy Moses Professor of Science at New York University, and the Director of the Emotional Brain Institute located at New York University and at the Nathan Klein Institute. And our third speaker will be Martin Teicher, who is Director of the Developmental Biopsychiatry Research Program at McLean Hospital and Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. So Rachel, please go ahead.
Thank you and good afternoon. I would like to share my screen. Is that okay? To show some slides?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna do that now with your permission. Terrific. So that was a wonderful introduction, and it segues beautifully into the biologic effects of fear and violence. And we can talk about both the short-term responses as well as the longer-term responses. And I'm sure that everybody in the room is familiar with the fight or flight response, which you might hear about from Dr. Ledoux. That would make a lot of sense, since he is the person that is most responsible for our understanding of what happens when an organism and people are exposed to threat, how their senses take in information, and what biologic circuits are activated to culminate in the fight or flight response. But what I'd like to focus on are two little aspects, which is what happens when the sympathetic nervous system is activated in fear, and that results in the release of adrenaline and rapid breathing. We're all familiar with this heart pounding out of our chest from fear. What also happens is the activation of from the brain to the adrenal glands to release the hormone cortisol. And cortisol is, of course, a hormone that helps contain the sympathetic nervous system response, meaning that it explains why your heart doesn't beat out of your chest forever after you have a fear response. And together, adrenaline and cortisol help form a memory of what happened, because we really want to learn from traumatic experiences. But what I want to emphasize in this slide is that the fight or flight response really describes short-term responses that pretty much return to baseline or homeostasis a short time after there is no longer a reason to be afraid, a short time after the actual physical challenge has passed. And this is something that we've known about for quite some time. And I think it is really interesting to contrast it with perhaps the long-term effects of fear or violence. So the one thing that would be a difference between the acute effects and the longer term effects, whereas the acute effects are kind of universal, and this is what happens to everyone when they're exposed to challenge. The long-term effects of violence are more variable, and a lot of what's been going on in science for the last few decades is really trying to understand what accounts for this variability. I know that's been a big focus of the work in my laboratory. And of course, when we talk about the long-term effects of violence, as was mentioned previously, we have to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, which was a diagnosis that appeared in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980, so it's 40 years old. And it's a very interesting disorder because it was really the first acknowledgement of long-term effects of trauma. And it was initially a controversial diagnosis, in part because the field was really more influenced by the paradigm of fight or flight, which another way of saying that is that there was an idea that if you're exposed to fear or trauma in adulthood, eventually you would get over it, that there wouldn't be long-lasting effects other than perhaps the memory of the event. And there wasn't a tremendously responses last so long, but in the last few years, our focus on epigenetic alterations and our understanding of epigenetics really helped explain that what partially happens in our long-term responses to fear is that that environmental events and our responses to them can change the way that genes function. And this has also led to an understanding of intergenerational effects. So in a very short period of time, the field of trauma has gone from thinking that responses to challenge are pretty transient to understanding that they endure, and even perhaps some effects might be passed to other generations. So just a quick description of PTSD. It's a condition that describes the effects of exposure to a watershed event, and interpersonal violence would definitely account for a lot of the PTSD that is seen in the world. And the symptoms are basically about re-experiencing the trauma through intrusive memories and nightmares. Yes, trauma is supposed to form a memory to help you learn from experiences, but sometimes those memories are just very difficult to cope with and bring back the same kind of physiological arousal as was experienced during the event. People with PTSD avoid reminders of the trauma. They experience changes in mood and cognition, and also physiological arousal. And of course, this leads to functional impairment in interpersonal, social, or occupational domains. And what's really interesting about PTSD is you can't really make the diagnosis until people have experienced symptoms for at least 1 month since the event has ended. So again, quite a contrast to fight or flight. What we've learned from talking to people that have PTSD is that the effects of a traumatic event, including violence, are not only enduring, but they're also transformative. And what you hear are things like, I'm not the same person I used to be, after people are exposed to really cataclysmic, violent events. And in the last few decades, epidemiologic and biologic studies have really been critical in shaping our understanding of the response to trauma. And I'll briefly show you that violence is really a leading precipitant of PTSD. And what you can see here is that rape is responsible for the greatest prevalence of PTSD, childhood traumatization, being threatened or being in combat or molested. And those kinds of events cause PTSD at greater rates than accidents or natural disasters. What I want to also point out in this slide is this yellow bar, which in all cases represents the prevalence of people that don't develop PTSD. It does not mean that they're not transformed or affected by the event. There's also a higher prevalence in women to both interpersonal violence and PTSD. But interestingly, women and men have about the same rates of PTSD with respect to accidents, terrorism, and disaster. And that's a really important thing to consider for this conversation. The other point I want to make briefly is that when you take a look at the prevalence of PTSD worldwide, you really see dramatic differences. And at first you think, well, maybe a country like Northern Ireland that has the greatest prevalence of PTSD is just a much more traumatized place than the People's China of Republic, which has a much lower prevalence rate of PTSD. What accounts for this difference? Is it trauma prevalence? And the short answer to this question is absolutely not. Trauma exposure is a global problem. Over 70% of people are exposed to at least one trauma. Over 30% are exposed to 4 or more traumatic events. So I think that as we consider the biological effects, think about these. Why do only some people develop PTSD, and what accounts for long-term effects? How important are cultural and societal factors? How important would policies be? Are biologic changes associated with PTSD really related to the severity of trauma exposure? Or are there other important risk factors for PTSD, including post-traumatic risk factors, which is whether we have healing societies? And does healing from trauma involve directly addressing biologic dysregulation? and how much of what we learn about biology of PTSD is relevant to recovering from the effects of trauma, and how can we deploy this information towards safer societies in which healing is commonplace. So with that, let me segue into biologic studies, really giving you, as we say in the Talmud, the whole story while standing on one foot. The first studies of post-traumatic stress disorder involved cortisol levels, which were obvious to study both adrenaline and cortisol levels. And while early studies showed that adrenaline levels were elevated in PTSD, which is what many people, this is a study that I published in 1990, and you can see that the cortisol levels are lower, and we quickly moved on to try to understand this in terms of the actions of cortisol as it binds to its glucocorticoid receptor. In order for hormones to have their effects, they have to bind to receptors and translocate into the nucleus. About 12 years later, we published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine talking about what we thought was happening, that basically in PTSD that there was an enhanced sensitivity of the glucocorticoid receptor, which would basically have a lot of implications for why people feel that everyday events are weighing more heavily on them and why they're triggered much more quickly and much more easily. But we knew that something at the molecular level must be determining how the glucocorticoid receptor is being expressed. And luckily, advances in molecular biology have allowed us to go inside the cell nucleus and actually examine the changes that are made on the glucocorticoid receptors in response to the environment, and advances in our understanding of epigenetics have really helped. So briefly, epigenetics is the study of how the environment produces alterations on genes that adjust the way genes function. So this is a little cartoon. This is your chromosome and this is the DNA. And basically, at all levels, epigenetic marks in the presence of the right enzymes can form on the DNA and really change the program of how the genes are expressed. And here's another little cartoon of this. And basically what we're talking about when we talk about epigenetic marks, which we can now measure, that's pretty recent, is that we can measure the effect of different to be condensed or expanded, which would have implications transcribed and all sorts of things like that. And why this is a game changer in understanding enduring effects of trauma is because epigenetic marks, once they sit on a DNA, this is a methyl group here sitting on a DNA, when the cell divides, which cells do, it's a process called mitosis, the parent cell divides to form two perfect daughter cells, an epigenetic mark that may have gotten there from the environment will still be present when the cell divides, and that is the definition. That is the reason that people have stated that epigenetic marks are heritable. So it turns out that there is now a lot of evidence for epigenetic alterations in PTSD, and we first showed this by looking at the glucocorticoid receptor since we had been studying it for 25 years. And what we found was that in combat veterans with PTSD, there was lower methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor, which explained to us why the gene why the glucocorticoid receptor itself was more sensitive to the effects of cortisol and stress. And since then, numerous studies have found evidence for changes in epigenetics in PTSD using candidate approaches, which is what this is, where you're looking at one specific place, or genome-wide approaches. Now, I think our work has had many implications because stress hormones, glucocorticoids, are responsible for a lot of functions in the body. They're play a role in memory, cognition, and stress systems, in the cardiovascular system, in the reproductive system, in the immune system, and also in terms of glucose and liver metabolism. So if you have a change in the fundamental way that the stress system functions after it's been exposed to cataclysmic watershed trauma, this is going to affect multiple systems for a long period of time. And a few years ago, we were very intrigued to see that there are intergenerational effects. And this is a study that we published about 6 years ago that shows epigenetic changes in this very gene that we found in combat veterans in association with maternal, that's the M, PTSD, people with a mother that has PTSD or a mother and a father with PTSD, versus people that have just a father with PTSD compared to people who don't have parents with PTSD. And this was kind of really illuminating for us, that the adult children of, in this case, Holocaust survivors would have these changes. And what was really interesting to us was the directional difference of the changes, depending on whether you had only a father with PTSD or a mother with PTSD. But then we quickly understood that when it comes to epigenetics, not only do epigenetic marks survive mitosis, which is the cell division that's constantly happening in your body, it can also survive meiosis, which is the cell division that makes oocytes. Men, sperms are made throughout reproductive life, but females are born with all their primary oocytes. So we have spent a lot of time over the last few years really understanding that especially childhood trauma and violence may have real implications for women who are exposed to trauma. So I'll just end with a few implications. I wanted to really point out to you that there are long-term effects of fear and violence, even maybe intergenerational effects. And this presents a mandate to society to reduce violence and its negative impact. Of course, we have emphasized in our work that not all epigenetic changes that are present in offspring are necessarily adverse. Some are, some aren't, but it's definitely something that we want to think about, because when events affect us, they may have far longer consequences. I pointed out that understanding biologic underpinnings of violence may help us understand individual risk factors, which might possibly lead to improved treatments. The status of the field right now is that there are several treatments for PTSD, none of which work on everyone. And so maybe as we understand some of the unique personal biologic underpinnings behind individual fear responses, we can optimize treatments of people. There's a very exciting area. Personalized medicine also can be applied to psychiatric illness. And then of course, the epidemiologic data showed that cultural and societal factors may play an important role in mitigating some of the long-term effects of trauma. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was wonderful. And now we will now move on to Joseph Ledoux.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all and to talk about this really important topic. I'm going to share my screen now, so give me a second to do that. So what I want to talk about today is the nature of fear itself. What is it? And possibly have we misunderstood what it is? Because if we have, that's a problem for figuring out how to use our understanding of fear to help people. So let's start with the question of why she's screaming. Everyone probably recognizes this picture from Psycho. This is obviously a case of violence against a woman, where the murderer is standing in front of the shower curtain, or she's behind the shower curtain. He's in front of it with a knife to stab her, and he does stab her and die. You don't see it on the screen, but the implication is obviously there. So why is she screaming? Obviously she's afraid, but the question is her fear the reason that she's screaming? Now, we all know that when we're afraid, we have all these responses that go with it. Rachel just pointed some of those out, the fight-flight response. Your you know, you freeze, your blood pressure and heart rate go up, stress hormones are released. And fear is thought to be the cause of those, but I have a different perspective on that, which I want to share with you today. And it's important because, again, if we don't know what we're looking for in the brain, we're never going to find it. So we have to have very clear understanding of what we're talking about when we say something like fear or anxiety. These are constructs, these are ideas. So here's some basic points. Fear versus anxiety. Fear is an emotion that happens to you when you're in the present of a danger that's right there, a snake at your feet, a mugger with a knife right in front of you, a gun pointed at your head, something that is very explicit and present. Anxiety, on the other hand, is more of a worry about something that hasn't happened yet. It's an anticipation, an expectation, and so forth. It's not there, it's just possible. But, you know, it can also be imagined. A person who is anxious about alien abduction is just has valid anxiety just as much as a person who's worried about their child about something like or COVID-19, for example. So, I mean, there are instances of normal and maladaptive fear and anxiety. Normal is, of course, what everybody has in their normal life when they are worried about something or encountering something dangerous. They have this fear, this anxiety that helps them cope with it. But on the other hand, fear and anxiety can be maladaptive. And the break point is whether it's interfering with your life on a regular basis. That's when you have, you know, a fear or anxiety disorder. But it's important to point out that fear and anxiety are scientific constructs. That's different from the actual thing that a person experiences. Constructs are scientific ways of defining something so that you can then study it and put a quantitative number on it, you can measure it. So, you know, again, I repeat this, our understanding of fear and anxiety is only as good or as bad as the constructs that we have. And I want to give you some examples of that through animal research, which is mostly what I've done most of my career. So a common view, and this is pretty much the standard view, fear is an innate response we've inherited from animals. These threats that occur in our lives make us feel afraid, and fear elicits the behavioral and physiological responses. Just as in the psycho picture, her fear is what causes her to scream. At least that's the interpretation. And for many years, I've worked, I don't know, 35 years, it's something I've worked on, this part of the brain called the amygdala, which has come to be the brain's fear center. This has become a cultural meme. Everybody seems to know that the brain is that the amygdala is the brain's fear center. And I've contributed to this idea, not because I've said it so much, but because of the way my work has been interpreted. I've always claimed that the amygdala was an unconscious detector of danger, and that fear was the conscious experience that happens when you are in danger. Now that may sound like a kind of a geeky, quirky, small definition or small distinction, but I think it's really important. You know, I used to say the amygdala is involved in unconscious fear, but whenever I'd be introduced to someone who discovered how our feelings of fear come from the amygdala. And so I've really been trying to clear up the language of all this and make it clear exactly what it is the amygdala does. For example, my view is the amygdala is a threat detector. It does this unconsciously. A threat out in the world is encountered. It goes through some sensory system like your visual system, takes it into your brain. It goes to your amygdala. Your amygdala triggers these freezing and fleeing responses and physiological reactions such as those Rachel was talking about. But this all happens non-consciously. There's no fear that's involved in that. So what is fear itself? Well, that's a different question. The threat detector is going to control these hardwired responses. It's what we've inherited from animals. But fear is the cognitive interpretation, the understanding that you are in harm's way. This is where we live our lives in our minds, and our understanding of the situation, and in particular, your understanding that it's you that is in a dangerous situation and that's going to be harmed is essential. I don't know if you can see my t-shirt here, but it says, no self, no fear. The self has to be involved in that cognitive interpretation, Otherwise, it's not, there's nothing to worry about. It's not you that's going to be harmed. I mean, you may say, well, it's my children that are going to be harmed, but that's your extended self. I mean, it's got to be personal to you. Otherwise, it's not an emotion. You can't have a non-personal emotion. That's just an oxymoron. So, when we develop medications, Rachel said they don't work as well as we would like. Maybe part of the problem is that we're asking the wrong question about the medications. So we put rats or mice through all these tests, and I do a lot of this kind of work myself. I'm not saying it's unimportant. I'm just saying we need to interpret it correctly. Put the rats or mice through a test, and if the rat is less timid, less behaviorally inhibited in the presence of that drug, you assume, because of the standard view, that the rat or the mouse is less fearful or anxious. And therefore, when you give the drug to a human, because we've inherited these circuits from our mammalian ancestors, the human should be less fearful or anxious. But instead, you might find that the drug does other things. For example, it might change the level of arousal, the person's hypersensitivity to threats and arousal. And might make the person more jumpy or may freeze more in a certain situation. But I don't think that's fear. Fear is this cognitive understanding. It's involved in the highest cognitive circuits of the brain that allow you to construct an interpretation of what's going on in your life at the moment. So if people are feeling fearful and anxious and involving circuits like areas like prefrontal cortex and circuits therein, but the drugs are designed to work on these threat detectors in areas like the amygdala, maybe it's not surprising that they aren't making people feel subjectively better, even though they might be having some effect here and there, and maybe it's different in each person. So I think it's, we have to really come to grips with what our constructs mean and how we should interpret them. So for example, for therapy to succeed, both the subjective state, the person's feeling of fear and anxiety, I mean, that's often what takes a person to see a therapist. They feel bad, they're anxious, they're fearful. But they also have these objective behavioral and physiological responses. They're more prone to freeze or to have startle responses or to be hyper aroused and nervous. So you have to change both. But unfortunately, what's been the practice now is assuming that the subjective experience will kind of come along for the ride when we change the behavior and physiology. And I think that's the crux of the problem. Subjective experience has to be part of our understanding of what this is all about. And ever since the behaviorist era in psychology, subjective experience has been pretty much out of the picture. Cognitive behavioral therapy came along first. Behavioral therapy came along first from the behaviorists, and that became cognitive behavioral. And that's still not so much about subjective experience. It's more about belief change and so forth. And that's got to be part of it. But we have to honor the subjective experience of the person, because that's where they live their lives in their head. So, one of the things drugs might do is like turn down the volume. It's like when we used to go to restaurants in New York and the music was too loud, somebody would ask the waiter to turn it down, so they turn it down. It might not have been the song you like very much, so it might still be an annoying song, but by lowering the volume, it's more tolerable. And I think that's kind of what drugs do in some cases. It's kind of to lower the volume. So, here's what I think what we have to, I can't read what the top of this is, so let me make this different. That's no good either. All right, so what we need to do is think of threats as stimuli that elicit symptoms that are associated with different brain symptoms. So for example, these ancient circuits we've inherited from animals control certain kinds of behavioral symptoms like freezing, autonomic nervous system arousal, all those fight-flight kinds of things. The amygdala, the periaqueductal gray, bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, those things are contributing to that. Other circuits control adaptive and pathological, especially habitual, when I say pathological, forms of avoidance behavior. These would be like striatal circuits. Still others circuits control memories, especially our declarative, explicit memories about things we know about the world, which are the basis of our beliefs and biases and expectations. These are controlled by areas in the medial temporal lobe and in the neocortical temporal lobe. It's where these memories are processed and stored. And still other circuits integrate all of the above into a subjective experience. And this involves, this is my hypothesis with certain colleagues that I've been working on this with, involving prefrontal cortex areas. So let's see. Okay, now I have to come back here. So I can get my, so alternately, people want to feel better, less fearful or anxious, and changing one symptom is not sufficient. The whole organism has to be treated, but we also have to know what fear is and what we can and can't learn from animal research. We can learn a lot, but we can't learn everything, and we have to know what that is so that we can interpret what the animal research can and can't tell us. So with that, I'm going to stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now we move on to Martin Teicher.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor and privilege. I'm going to talk about how childhood maltreatment affects trajectories of brain development, and how this in turn biases the individual in an enduring way in terms of how they perceive threat and how they experience, or the extent to which they experience fear of violence. And the basic hypothesis that we've been pursuing for many years is that childhood maltreatment alters trajectories of brain development and can lead to a host of symptoms. Among those, and some of the most prevalent, are anxiety and increased levels of fear. Now, big concern is first, what is early life stress doing to the brain? When I started doing this research, the idea that we had was that stress was bad for the brain, and stress during early development was particularly bad for the developing brain. But then in about the year 2000, it sort of dawned on me that, does this actually make sense that through all the eons of evolution that the brain has not evolved to be able to handle and be relatively resilient to the effects of early life stress? Which leads to the alternative interpretation that early life stress generates molecular and neurobiological effects that alter neural development in a potentially adaptive way that prepares the brain to survive childhood and reproduce in a malevolent world. And that the consequences may be very important at the present time. They also may be highly maladaptive under different circumstances. So I'm not talking about childhood maltreatment damaging the brain, but childhood maltreatment producing phenotypic adaptations. And so what might be a beneficial phenotypic adaptation if you're living in a malevolent world? And one part might be maybe better to have an enhanced ability to detect and respond to threats. And we started looking at the basic circuit that Professor Ledoux had laid out, with stimuli coming into the thalamus and this very rapid pathway that can go to the amygdala unconsciously and lead to an unconscious response, and also then projections to sensory cortex and prefrontal cortex and hippocampus and other regions that may lead to your conscious awareness and your sensation of fear. And here's our updated diagram. But the basis is still the same, that there's the potential for a very rapid unconscious or below the level of conscious response to threat. And there's also circuitry that's involved in the perception of the threat and in aspects such as experiencing fear. All of these lead to responses such as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal response and the autonomic nervous system response and the noradrenergic response that Rachel have talked about. If we had time, I would go through all of the key components of this system and tell you how they're affected by childhood maltreatment at different ages and to different types of trauma. I really only have time to talk about two of these, and I'll talk about sensory cortex and I'll talk about the amygdala. Our understanding of sensory cortex emerged from some studies we did, which asked the question, does the nature of the maltreatment matter? And this was done by Ji-wook Choi and Akemi Tamada, who were visiting scientists from South Korea and Japan in the lab. And we looked at individuals who had high levels of exposure to parental verbal abuse, to individuals who visually witnessed multiple episodes of domestic violence, and individuals who had experienced childhood sexual abuse. And we're looking at them in early adulthood. And we looked at fiber tracks and we looked at gray matter volume. And these analyses were unbiased whole brain analyses in which all the information is basically fed into the computer, and the computer identifies the regions that differ as a consequence of the degree of exposure to the experience. So we're not specifically looking at regions of interest, we're seeing what the computer has identified. It turns out that high levels of exposure to parental verbal abuse specifically alters gray matter volume in the auditory cortex, and it affects the integrity of a fiber pathway called the arcuate fasciculus. And the arcuate fasciculus connects Broca and Wernicke's area, and it's a key language pathway. In contrast, visually witnessing domestic violence affects gray matter volume in the visual cortex, and it affects the integrity of the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, and the inferior longitudinal fasciculus interconnects visual cortex with limbic system and determines our memory and emotional response to things that we see. In contrast, childhood sexual abuse also affects visual cortex, more secondary visual cortex, particularly areas involved in facial recognition. This is all work from our lab. Complementary work done by Christine Heim and Charlie Nemiroff have also shown that women with repetitive childhood sexual abuse had specific thinning in the somatosensory cortex, and in particular, in the portions of the somatosensory cortex involved in touch and feeling from the clitoris and the surrounding genital area. So that you can see that the sensory systems that are conveying this information is being altered in perhaps a way to help these individuals contend with what they're experiencing. Of course, this can have consequences. For instance, this may effects on this somatosensory cortex may very much impact this individual's ability to experience sexual pleasure later in life. Then turning to the amygdala, we're interested in what types of experiences affect how the amygdala responds to threat. And this is done by Zhenjun Zhu, who has completed his PhD thesis in the lab. And abnormalities in the amygdala have been response to threat have been reported in a whole host of psychiatric disorders. And the abnormal amygdala response is often hyperactive. It over-responds to threat, but in some cases it may be a hypoactive or blunted response to threat. The hyperactive responses are associated with anxiety and problems with inhibition, whereas the blunted response would be associated with risk-taking and inappropriate social behavior. So our objective was to identify the type and timing of maltreatment that are most important predictors of hyperactive and hypoactive amygdala response. Basically building on this kind of finding, several studies have shown hyperactive amygdala response. This paper by Danlowski showed that seeing a threatening stimulus activated the right amygdala particularly, and the degree of activation depended on your degree of exposure to childhood trauma. The higher your childhood trauma questionnaire score, the greater your degree of amygdala activation to the threat. And we created an instrument called the Maltreatment Abuse Chronology of Exposure Scale to give us information, at least retrospective, on severity of exposure to 10 types of maltreatment, and to these 10 types of maltreatment across each age of childhood. We point out that this scale has very high test-retest reliability, as does all instruments used to evaluate childhood trauma. Individuals are remarkably consistent in what they report. We also have a problem. There's a large number of predictive variables, so we're using artificial intelligence to identify the key important determinants. But basically in the scanner, individuals are seeing fearful, angry faces in certain blocks. They're seeing neutral faces, or they're seeing simple geometric shapes. And we compare the response to, say, the fearful faces to the neutral faces, the fearful faces to the shapes, to see the degree of amygdala activation. And this is the data comparing the response to the fearful faces versus the shapes. And this graph is showing how important various predictors are. These are the 10 types of maltreatment: emotional neglect, nonverbal emotional abuse, pure emotional abuse, pure physical abuse, physical neglect, parental verbal abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing interparental violence, and witnessing violence to siblings across each age of childhood. And the most important predictor was pure emotional abuse at age 15. Also very important was pure emotional abuse at age 13. Others included physical abuse at age 4, physical abuse at age 3, pure physical abuse at age 6. So this is telling us what types of experience were associated with the greatest alterations in response to fearful versus neutral shapes. It doesn't show us how the amygdala is responding. Is it an increased response or is it a decreased response? And what we found was if we looked at how much exposure they had to peer emotional bullying at the most important predictive ages, that the more exposure they had, the greater their amygdala response, the more hyperreactive the amygdala was, which was quite significant. But in contrast, their degree of exposure to early physical maltreatment, 3, 4, 6 years of age, was associated with a blunting of amygdala response. So we proposed that maltreatment associated brain alterations are phenotypic adaptations that enhance survival and reproductive success in our evolutionary past, though they may be counterproductive at the present time. This leads to the question of whether prepubertal versus postpubertal maltreatment associated differences in amygdala function make adaptive sense. During the early prepubertal period, children do not have the ability to control their experience through fight or flight reactions and may need to remain strongly attached to parents who act abusively. Hence, their survival might depend on having a reduced amygdala response to threat. In contrast, adolescents who are better able to reduce their exposure to abuse through fight or flight reactions, in this case, in a strong amygdala response or a hyperreactive amygdala response may be adaptive. However, a hyperactive amygdala response to threat can be disadvantageous in less hostile situations, as individuals may misread neutral expressions as threatening, and this may put them at increased risk for anxiety, depression, PTSD, and unstable relationships. In contrast, individuals with a hypoactive amygdala response may fail to adequately respond to threats or salient signals, may repeatedly make the same kind of mistakes in life, and are at increased risk for substance use disorders. One of the things that we've been very interested in is why are some individuals resilient? How can some individuals can experience very severe exposure to childhood maltreatment, but appear to be symptom-free? And so we've been looking at that, and the key finding is that first, their brains are not spared. We thought that neurobiological and psychiatric consequences of maltreatment would go hand in hand, but they don't. The brains of the maltreated individuals without symptoms are not spared. They have the same alterations in stress-susceptible structures. But they also have an additional set of alterations that seem to enable them to effectively compensate for the changes introduced by this early life stress. And the primary one is reduced connectivity of the right amygdala in terms of the brain network architecture. And this seems to be associated with a high level of resilience in these individuals. We've also been looking at the effects of mindfulness. This is research being done by Diane Johnson in the laboratory and KM1 Award with Sarah Lazar, who's an expert in mindfulness. And she's done 2 studies looking at mindfulness. The first one here is versus a waiting list control. She's just completed another one versus an active control. These individuals are going through an 8-week stress reduction procedure and with mindfulness. And these are all individuals with mild to moderate exposure to childhood maltreatment. And we find that the amygdala does change in volume as it goes through this 8-week program. Interestingly, it's a rate-dependent effect. Individuals with a smaller than average amygdala wind up with their amygdala becoming even smaller, whereas individuals with a larger than average amygdala wind up with their amygdala becoming even larger. Changes in the amygdala were associated with changes in symptom scales. So in this case, the change in the right amygdala accounted for a very substantial proportion of the variance in their mindful attention awareness scale and in their self-compassion scale. Changes in the volume of the left amygdala were associated, accounted for a significant portion of the variance in their perceived stress scale, in their interpersonal reactivity index, and in their adult rejection sensitivity. So basically, in conclusion, threat detection and response appears to be programmed by early experience, and this can heighten or blunt the amygdala response to threat. Mindfulness attenuates some of the symptoms in individuals with mild to moderate histories of childhood maltreatment, which correlate with changes in amygdala volume, and alterations in amygdala connectivity may be associated with reduced susceptibility to the effects of childhood maltreatment on fear and anxiety. And thank the funding sources, and thank you all for listening.
Wonderful, thank you. It was really quite a treat to get to hear this work from 3 scientists who've done so much of the foundational work in this area. So we can start collecting questions through the chat. I think the first thing I would like to ask is if each of our panelists, as you were listening to the other panelists' questions, had anything that you thought of. Did you spurred any ideas or any comments that you'd like to make? Okay, that's fine. You'll have time to bring those up. So the first question that I'm going to pose to the panel is about the general dose response and the relationship between fear and its biosocial, psychological effects. What is the timing of those? How quickly do those changes occur? And what is the relationship between the persistence and the dose of the fear and its impact?
I mean, are you talking about an immediate threat and how long it takes to have an impact?
Right, so with the fear, how long does it take to actually change?
Instant.
Instantly, but then also permanently, long-term change.
And as Rachel said, I mean, the fight-flight response is triggered instantly. And that's, these are all more or less, I hate to use the word hardwired, but these are innate responses with pattern physiological, innate behaviors with pattern physiological behavioral, physiological components in the autonomic nervous system and stress system that allow you to try to cope with the situation. But as the situation becomes overly stressful, those no longer are helpful and they sort of become toxic. I'm sort of talking about Rachel now, so maybe she wants to pick up there.
And I would just talk about what you said, Joe, which is to point out that how you think about something is the key component of whether something is going to be fearful. And I think that one of the things that was initially frustrating in the field was that there isn't a linear dose-response relationship between severity of trauma, whatever that means, and whoever is judging that, and response. So there's a lot of real opportunity to develop healing societies, to develop ways that we can teach people how to think about adversity and what it means, to prepare people with resilience building skills. So I think that that's all really good news, that just because a certain thing happens that someone nominates on a scale of 1 to 10 as a 5 stressor, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to respond uniformly to it. So we can be less afraid of that 5 stressor if we know that there are ways that we can counteract the effects. Of course, it would be good to take away the stressors that we can take away with, but I think all 3 talks basically had the same message, which is there's a tremendous amount of resiliency. There's a tremendous amount of things that override negative consequences, but still violence, maltreatment, those are things that are very, very challenging and have very long-lasting effects.
The way I like to put it is that, it really is all in your mind, not in a bad way, but in a way that, to the extent that our concepts, our conceptualization of situations are part of our problem, they can also be part of our solution. It's not something that permanently changed. We can change, and we just heard about meditation, and obviously that's a good way to produce some of these changes.
I'd also like to point out in terms of the time course that while the immediate effects can be instantaneous, that in terms of childhood maltreatment, some changes occur rapidly, but there are also delayed responses, so that, say, effects on hippocampal volume may not be noticeable for many years after the exposure, and that certain symptoms don't emerge until many years after the exposure. So there's actually a silent period between exposure and adverse outcomes. So one can't assume that a young child has experienced trauma is well. In many cases, they really begin to experience the symptoms when they go through puberty. And which also, though, means that there's time to preempt some of the consequences, like the emergence of depression, emergence of substance abuse, which may occur many years later.
Okay, well, the next question is going to combine a couple of things coming in from our chat room. Again, focused on the timing of the fear and the brain response and when we might intervene. So one question is focused on mindfulness. And what is the timing of when mindfulness is helpful? And does it matter in the acute phase of the fear? Or does it matter at what age?
So great question. There's been relatively few studies looking at the effect of mindfulness in the treatment of individuals with childhood adversity. In our case, we were looking at mindfulness in young adults. And it seemed to be, helpful. It's to a significant degree. It's usually more helpful if it's going to be closer to the time of the trauma, but you also have to have a certain level of cognitive development and awareness and prefrontal development to, I think, be able to really effectively use mindfulness.
I mean, this is, everybody says this, but it's true. I mean, good old-fashioned breathing is a good way to kind of get the parasympathetic nervous system to tone down the sympathetic, and that doesn't take a lot of cognitive sophistication. So, kids could certainly be taught that if they are.
Yeah. And the fact, just teaching kids and adults that there are things they can do when they're confronted with fear or trauma is very important. Breathing through it, I think, is really important. But just the idea that you can process the trauma, you can talk about what happened, you could seek social support, that it's not written in stone that you're going to have negative consequences just because you have been exposed. It's a time that you can give yourself permission for self-care, and that you have a window of time where you can ameliorate a bad situation. That's a very important message.
Although it's often the case that individuals who come in seeking treatment are often experiencing intense symptoms. And so you're telling them that they may not experience symptoms.
No.
Those particular cases, but then you have to be really careful because, it may be very hard to hear what you're saying, and you may have to respond to them in a very special way. One of the things that you really need to do is to really be able to help them calm down and help them achieve this, and that and so that more somatic treatments tend to be better than cognitive-based treatments at the point, because it's often very, very hard to hear and interpret if you've been highly traumatized in childhood.
Yeah, I'm more speaking about the immediate aftermath, and that we want to really make sure that the systems that we have put in place to care for victims of violence and things like that are really designed to be maximally healing instead of triggering or stressful, because those moments in the aftermath of a trauma, the hours afterwards, can really make a very big difference into whether you have long-term effects. I agree with you. If somebody comes to treatment and telling them to breathe, that's not what I'm suggesting. They come in extraordinary distress, but that's usually well after something has passed. And what they're coping with is the fact that they're having this longer-term response that they have not been able to sort of mitigate on their own. So that's a very different issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wonder, a question from one of our forum members is, Dr. Ledoux, Dr. Teicher, maybe talk a little bit, and certainly Dr. Yehuda, you as well, how does your work on the amygdala kind of coalesce? And then in what areas does it not coalesce? How do we kind of understand research on the amygdala altogether?
Well, I think I didn't hear too much that was contradictory in the discussions. I mean, I would say that there seemed to be a lot of convergence. Nobody was talking about, fear living in the amygdala and bubbling up out of there as such. I mean, there's a lot of talk about threat processing, and I think that's unequivocally what the amygdala does. And whether it is a seat of some kind of conscious experience that we've inherited from animals is really hard to know, because we can't ask the animals what they're feeling. But we do know that in humans, damage to the amygdala can, in some conditions, leave the subjective experience of fear intact. There are ways we can stimulate the amygdala subliminally, that the person doesn't know the threat is there and doesn't feel fear, and yet the amygdala is activated and heart rate is beating away and palms are sweating. So it's not fear that's causing those responses in the subjective sense. So, you know, we're in the middle of a big project now that's only gotten started recently and got slowed down by the COVID pandemic. But it's funded by the Templeton Foundation to look at the role of cortical areas like the prefrontal cortex and subjective fear in relation to the non-conscious aspects of threat processing by the amygdala, and see, you know, exactly if we can get some data on all of this.
It's interesting. One of the things that we're doing in the scanner was giving them a psychosocial stress paradigm, which is basically something similar to a Trier social stress test in the scanner, and that individuals become very stressed and quite upset. And interesting, what happens in many of these individuals is their amygdala and their hippocampus become less active, but their cortisol goes up. So there's a lot that we still need to understand, but in terms of integrating the work that we're doing, you know, my study is just built on what Professor Ledoux had published earlier, and I need to take now some of these, you know, new ideas and look at those in terms of the research that we're doing. But that work is foundational.
Yeah, and I would just simply add that what Marty says makes a lot of sense to me in terms of that finding. The amygdala being activated isn't a bad thing. It just it's needed at the time to process a threat. So you don't the body is responding to something. So I think that we want to make a distinction between a stressor and a stress response, and that's just really an important thing to be able to do.
So, you know, the poor amygdala, we expect so much of it. Yeah. It will respond.
Doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, but it will respond to appetitive, pleasurable stimuli, things that, you know, that's like and so forth, that work for and so forth, and in humans as well. That's responds to pain. It responds, I don't know, probably to love, and, you know, it's just, there's a lot of stuff that happens, and you can't use that as a diagnostic test for fear or anything else. People will write papers. Well, we thought we were studying X, Y, and Z, but because the amygdala was active, we must have been studying fear. So that's, you know, that's one thing that's wrong. The other is that that fear doesn't have an exclusive contract with the amygdala. You can be on a mountaintop starving to death and fear that you're going to die from a lack of food, or from being too cold, or from lack of water. Each of those involves different brain systems, hypothalamic, you know, homeostatic systems. But you can be afraid of what's going to happen. You can also fear the eventuality of death, or the, you know, possibility of not leading a meaningful life. So the amygdala is not, you know, the answer to fear. It's an important part of the puzzle of how the brain responds to certain kinds of stimuli. And it's not always threat stimuli that it's responding to.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting a few questions focused on substance use and how that impacts these physiological relationships, both acutely and long-term. And the questions have been focused mostly on alcohol and THC, but I think that feel free to respond to any type of illegal substance or legal substance.
Well, one thing I can say, I mean, it's just a place filler in a way, that we have a grant from NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, to study avoidance behavior, not because we're studying addiction, but because they view avoidance as a form of negative reinforcement. And so they think that we can learn something about the negative reinforcement that goes on in addiction. In other words, it's not always about getting the high, it's also about, you know, the consequences of things not being there, like the absence of the hedonic experience. And so that you have these negative consequences and positive consequences. I didn't put that very clearly, but in other words, that all these systems are kind of converging in certain parts of the brain, or they're involved in lots of different aspects of different behaviors. So we got addictive behaviors, we got threat behaviors, sexual behaviors, maternal behaviors. You can find all of that passing through the amygdala in one way or another. It doesn't mean the amygdala is responsible for all of that, but it's contributing. Different circuits perhaps contributing.
So a number of these drugs of abuse have anti-anxiety properties. They affect the GABA system, which is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and they will, to a certain degree, alleviate anxiety in the short term. And both have generally been shown to blunt amygdala response to threat, but they also affect prefrontal cortex. And individuals can respond very differently. So for some, alcohol may enable them to be less fearful and braver, whereas others have different kinds of responses. They're in the long term problematic because there's often a great deal of rebound. But you know, they certainly, some of them have anxiety, anti-anxiety responses, and some people do very well with marijuana as an anti-anxiety medication. One of the things that if I had more time I would talk about is the effects of ketamine on the response. Ketamine has very strong effects on the amygdala's response to threat, and very useful in individuals with intense fear. That's one of the few things that will actually reduce the level of fear.
Great. So another question is focused more just asking more about intergenerational trauma, and what are predictors? How does nurture impact intergenerational trauma? And I know that there's a lot more to learn, but maybe you guys could kind of talk about where your thinking is going with intergenerational trauma and where we can fill some gaps.
Yeah, just briefly, people report being affected by experiences that have occurred before they were born. Now, what I thought for many, many years was that this is because they were raised by people who are affected by those experiences. And if you would have asked me 10 years ago, that is what I would have told you. But I think that the research in the last decade, particularly in animal models, suggests that there's a little more to it than that. And that different kind of biologic changes that occur in response to trauma can linger and be passed. When a person says, I feel affected by a traumatic experience that my parents had, there's a lot there to unpack. And it could reflect parenting, it could reflect life circumstances, it can reflect biologic transmission. Although most of the time when people think about biologic transmission, they're thinking about adaptive qualities being transmitted, what Marty said, but it's just the circumstance that the person is living in that may make that not so. It's a complicated topic, but it's an important topic because, you know, in mice studies, it's very intriguing that if you teach a mouse how to fear a cherry blossom by giving it a shock, that mouse has epigenetic changes associated with fear, but so does their male offspring. Even though when that male rat offspring smells a cherry blossom, they're afraid of it, even though they haven't been exposed to the shock. So there's a lot there to explore, and I think that it has real significance in terms of our policies and healing societies. Although in people, we can't really study the direct mechanisms. Just because you don't know exactly how something works doesn't mean that it's not a true concept. So we're still in the early phases of being able to unpack it, much as with PTSD when we were in the early phases of studying that before we had the proper molecular and neuroimaging tools to look at that.
So you spoke a little bit about, at the individual level, the difference between directed violence, abuse, et cetera, versus witnessing violence and how those are a little bit different. Could you talk a little bit about other layers of trauma, such as community violence or systemic racism, or traumas that are not at the individual level, but more at the community level?
Who are you asking that question to?
Whoever wants to,
Oh.
whoever wants to take it.
Well, if you take Dr. Ledoux's formulation that a traumatic experience is really about what you think about an event, then, I mean, that to me makes perfect sense. And that how much you are affected by any of these things in the environment has a lot to do with the cognitive meaning. Witnessing violence to an anonymous person may be terrible, but witnessing it to a family member, the same, will have more of a valence because you understand and know that this person has a connection to you. So I think, again, yeah, I think that the meaning of an event can really shape the response to it.
You know, we actually have some data that was sort of very surprising in that it said the opposite. So we looked at a study of individuals who were exposed to harsh corporal punishment. These are individuals who are frequently spanked by their parents, often with an implement, and sometimes on parts of the body other than their buttocks. And about 40% of the individuals in the sample said that this is the best thing that ever happened to them, and they will do the same thing to their kids when they have kids. The remaining thought that it was pretty awful. But their brains were changed in the same way. There was no difference. So sometimes how you interpret it or how you reflect upon it may not have that much consequences. You know, in some ways, the body does keep the score too, in terms of when you're experiencing something so intense. I think in terms of the general question, though, the slide that Rachel presented showing the risk of PTSD based on different forms of adversity and how rape and childhood trauma were significantly more likely to produce PTSD than a natural disaster is very important. And I think in particular with children, that they can tolerate a great deal and are often highly resilient if their parents are with them and are supporting them through the experience, because they really buffer a great deal of the stress through the attachment bond. And that maltreatment can be so deleterious to the degree that it's a betrayal of that attachment.
Marty, you just said something really important that I want to underscore, and that is you can have two highly different responses to something like spanking with the same brain change. And what that shows is that sometimes we're measuring biological phenomenon that have nothing to do with the experience of someone. And that's a lot of, a big challenge in our biologic work is to separate out the biology of exposures, which may or may not relate to the impact of those exposures, and the biology of exposure per se. So I think that that's not inconsistent. That just means that there are definitely a class of biologic responses that are studied in connection with adversity that may not be informative to the outcome of that adversity, and that it would be just really important to get a handle on that.
Yes, agreed.
That might be a good segue into a question about social emotional learning, and I'll read the question. Is there any evidence that shows that children or adults with significant trauma experience can benefit from social emotional learning approaches alone?
I wouldn't know what to say to that.
Me neither.
Can you say the question again?
It's asking about social emotional learning, helping children or adults. I think the point is, first of all, social emotional learning, but also is it a singular approach that has a growing evidence base?
Yeah, not in a position to comment.
Okay, well, that might be, we've just found a really important research question. So another question around intervention came up around what Dr. Teicher just brought up about nurturing individuals. And is that also a promising approach, that if we can create structures where people do have trusted, nurturing caregivers, at least some in their life? What is the evidence around that as an approach?
So there's tons of evidence around that is a very big mitigator of adversity following childhood maltreatment, if there was somebody that you could go to for comfort. A lot of people that have negative outcomes report adversity to someone who doesn't believe them, or it would be too expensive for the person to believe them or act on it. But if you had someone to go to, someone to be nurturing towards you, that can really help. And the lessons there are really about, are we creating nurturing enough societies? And the reason that I showed the worldwide prevalences is because maybe some countries have these in place. I mean, maybe the lack of PTSD or the lower rates implies something else, maybe stigma for reporting symptoms, who knows. But is there something that we can learn from societies where the reaction to traumatic experiences seems to be better? And what can we do? We may not be able to prevent traumatic events from occurring, but we can certainly create better containers for people who have been exposed to them, and more healing societies, which I think is the reason that you are doing this this workshop, because we can't just say, oh, you know, stuff happens. Stuff happens. What are we going to do about it in terms of making sure that we ameliorate the negative effects? Because that is something that we can talk about.
Rachel, if you took that list of countries and did some sort of analysis of their healthcare systems, I wonder what it would look like.
That would
Because
be
obviously we have a system that is not,
fantastic question. Yeah.
you know,
Yep.
helpful to people without means.
Well, we are nearing the end of our time, so let me ask if any of our panelists have one final thought that you would like to leave our audience with.
I think just to follow up on the last question, that I think a lot of work needs to go into what are the protective factors. One of the things that we've found is that school connectedness can be a pretty significant protective factor. And so I'm very concerned about that in our current situation with the COVID-19. But I think we really have to do some very fine work delineating types of protective factors and ages when these particular protective factors may either enhance your resilience or rescue you from a previous exposure.
I have my last thought is not about application so much, because I'm a basic scientist and I try to understand the relation of brain to mental concepts, which is just a plea that we take more care in formulating exactly what we're studying when we study things and use big words like fear around them.
Excellent, good. Dr. Yehuda?
Yeah, I echo those last thoughts, but I think that, again, I think the most important thing that we can do is focus on resilience building at a time when there is a lot of violence in society, and try to figure out ways in which we can teach people to either access care or cope. And I don't think that, and I think we want to be creative about it and really think about what social systems other than mental health clinics can be deployed to really create healing societies.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those final thoughts and for the presentations and the discussion. It certainly leaves us with plenty to do and to think about. And thank you for the work you've contributed to get us this far along. Our next session will focus on perception, culture, and psychology as it relates to fear of violence. I'll introduce the speakers quickly, and then we will take a short break, wrapping up, coming back together at 3 o'clock. So our next session's speakers include Park Dietz, who is president of Park Dietz and Associates Threat Assessment Group, Polly Weissner, who is distinguished professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Utah, Jennifer Masia, who is an author at The Trace, and Helen Neville, who is professor of educational psychology and African American studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And Jackie Campbell, who is well known to many of us. She is a forum member and professor and Anna D. Wolf Chair at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing, will be our moderator. And so I have 1:46, so we have exactly a 14-minute break, and Lisa will reconvene us at exactly 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Okay, break.
I see that we have some new people joining, and for those of you who have just joined and we finished our first session, and we will start session number 2 at exactly 3 o'clock Eastern time. So just a couple more minutes before we get rolling again.
For everyone that's joined in, thank you for joining us today. Definitely see that all of you are coming under the name of Alex. But in order to fix that, you would go next to the Alex that represents you. It says more and then rename. You can rename putting your actual name in, and that would help us differentiate each one of you. Thank you. Miss Honey, if you're there, could you please say hi or turn on your webcam so I can rename you?
All right. So it is 3 o'clock, and we are going to get started again. And so I ask for our first speaker, Park Dietz. Actually, let's give this one more minute, just one more minute. All right, Park, if you'd like to get started.
You bet. I'm going to be speaking more as a clinician and a sociologist than as an empirical researcher. We might do well to consider fear of violence as one aspect of a broader phenomenon that might be conceptualized as the subjective experience of existential threat. That is, the subjective perception that one's personal or social identity or one's bodily integrity is threatened and in danger. A unified theory of threat perception needs to have room for the concept that perceived threats of many kinds are processed similarly in neural pathways, and that this contributes to a great many otherwise puzzling responses, such as when even words without sticks or stones induce freezing, withdrawal, or aggression. Even the subjective perception that one has been unfairly discriminated against, called a racist, called a liar, called a bad parent, or otherwise shamed or disrespected, can elicit the same extreme and often maladaptive responses as a threat to kill, because each of these insults can be perceived as a threat to the individual's personal or social identity. How individuals become so sensitive to words, attitudes, body language, and facial expressions that their brains perceive them as existential threats may be one of the most important empirical questions of our time. I have no answers, but my guess is that the old advice to ignore such things and develop thicker skin has been supplanted by myriad encouragements to overreact and positive reinforcement for doing so. That is a formula for weakness, not strength, and may account for more of the variance in the fear of violence in America than any other variable, and certainly more than we're comfortable addressing. What I know about fear of actual violence stems from studying actual violence, sometimes with systematic data collection from samples of varying size, but mostly from clinical or forensic data, collected one case at a time, often in great depth, thousands of times over. The violent offenders I've interviewed over the past 40-some years are something of a who's who of the notorious criminals of America, with an overrepresentation of mass murderers, serial killers, and the other kinds of seemingly unfathomable killers whose stories engender the greatest interest and fear in the public. In the same time frame, I've been working with US-based corporations to prevent workplace violence, in which context I've consulted on many thousands of cases in which workers have feared violence because of bullying, domestic abuse, stalking, and threats. These cases afford me an opportunity to see the occasional false positive, such as cases in which someone was terrified because a coworker bought a gun for self-defense, or because they overheard a customer mention that he was a combat veteran. But I see many more cases in which victims who are in true danger from abusive partners or from the escalating misconduct of a poorly managed employee are in denial, assuring others he'd never hurt me, or that's just the way he is. Many victims, particularly in domestic violence cases, are too afraid of retaliation against themselves or their children to take affirmative steps to escape true danger. In considering fear of violence, we need to recognize that the capacity to experience fear is not distributed uniformly across the population. One need only consider risk-taking adolescents, bomb disposal technicians, test pilots, and criminals to see that not everyone has an equal capacity to experience fear. A sizable proportion of violent offenders has an atypical response to fear-arousing conditions, as demonstrated in studies of psychopaths. The psychopath's delayed arousal to fear explains the experience of a young killer in the rural South who years ago struggled to give me any example of a time that he had felt afraid. After a long, thoughtful pause, he asked, "You mean that cottonmouth?" He recalled, "I had that one time when this big bear was charging me. I tried to shoot him and my gun jammed. He kept it coming and I got that cottonmouth." Despite these anomalies, most of us are capable of experiencing fear of violence when the risk is lower, more remote in time, and less consequential than being mauled by a bear. Most importantly, perhaps, most of us are vulnerable to being made afraid by what we experience only vicariously, regardless of how low or remote the risk. This reflects a defect in our capacity to rationally gauge risk, particularly when data are incomplete and particularly when emotionally aroused. A human flaw that is perpetuated and perpetually exploited by legacy media, social media, and Hollywood to the detriment of us all. The reporting bias that determines which cases and which events are emphasized or even reported creates a distorted... Pardon me? What was that?
It was just someone without their mute on. Go ahead.
The reporting bias that determines which cases and events are emphasized or even reported at all creates a distorted sense of reality in which rare risks feel omnipresent and common risks are ignored or minimized. No rational observer could doubt that uncommon, unrepresentative, and sensational homicides, such as serial killers, active shooters, and particularly gruesome murders, receive far more mention, repetition, and fear than more common and representative forms of homicide, such as those occurring in the context of domestic violence, gang violence, or bar fights. We all know that this is because media are in the business of selling advertising, content, or both, but the effects of reporting bias can be far-reaching. Here's an example of the disproportionate impact of highly publicized rarities. In the 1970s and 1980s, news media in New York City provided sensational coverage of cases in which offenders killed commuters by pushing them onto the tracks before oncoming subway trains. This seemingly random crime is perfect tabloid fodder, as every commuter in the city can identify with the victim. Dr. Dan Martell and I published a study of every case in which this occurred during the 17 years from 1975 to 1991, which was a total of 49 incidents. Despite the occurrence of this crime, an average of less than 3 times per year, our unpublished survey of commuters on a sample of subway platforms suggested that a majority of the millions of New Yorkers commuting by subway reported taking steps every day to avoid being pushed onto the tracks. Imagine how many more lives could be saved if people were equally cautious in their choice of mates, in deciding whether to join a gang, or in selecting the company with whom to drink. A second example, as the concept of serial killer caught the public imagination, an entire industry of true crime documentaries flourished to endlessly recount the stories of the most extreme and interesting serial killers. Such documentaries are not always accurate, frequently fabricate scenes with dramatized reenactments, and are mostly junk TV of little value, yet they attract large audiences and are shown repeatedly on the cable channels specializing in this genre. And since the success of Silence of the Lambs, fictional serial killers have been invented more frequently than actual serial killers have been identified, heightening the public's fear, vicariously traumatizing some viewers with vivid scenes of murder, mayhem, and dismemberment, while sexually stimulating others through those same images, and contributed to a bidding war, in fact, a frenzy, among the legions of women who compete to marry the few serial killers who are safely locked up in prison. None of these effects of the reporting bias contributes to the greater good. As a third and final example, consider the phenomenon of mass murder. I've studied mass murder since the 1980s and recognized early on that each time news shows overdid their coverage of these crimes, there was another mass murder soon thereafter. During TV interviews about the latest mass murder, I'd often told the interviewer, if you continue to cover this story 24/7, we'll have another one within 2 weeks. And I was usually right. This is because mass murder is a form of suicide. And more than half the killers are dead by the end of the day. Suicide has long been known to be contagious, which is one of the reasons that responsible journalists were once careful about how they reported suicide. But mass murder was too sensational for them to ignore. So I provided guidelines to the media about how to report mass murder with less risk of spawning copycats. These recommendations were occasionally followed by one or another media outlet and eventually garnered support from some grassroots groups. But on the whole, the media continued to propagate the fad. This changed somewhat with the introduction of the term active shooter, which encompassed most of the mass murders in the US, but also encompasses a large number of cases with fewer and less serious casualties. For some, this new term had the dual advantages of increasing the apparent size of the problem and of ignoring all of the other weapons that have been used, such as bombs, fire, poisons, vehicles, edged weapons, and anthrax, helping to legitimize the concept of, quote, gun violence, end quote, as though guns were capable of violence. Judging by the number of Google searches on the term active shooter, it must have come into widespread use in the media around 2015. The effects of this recharacterization were dramatic. Suddenly, schools, universities, government agencies, and corporations experienced demands from their stakeholders to provide active shooter training. As best I can tell, the usual forms of such training have done more harm than good. For each of the occasional survivors who have said such training helped him, there must be thousands of children and adults who found such training frightening or even traumatic, and whose first thought upon entering a classroom, office building, theater, or mall is now to wonder how they'd escape if a shooter burst through the door. Moreover, an emphasis on how to respond to this rare occurrence has sometimes displaced the far more important issues surrounding the primary prevention of bullying, stalking, and violence. Each of these examples illustrates how fear of violence can be generated, propagated, and magnified by selective reporting and by a focus on the most extreme, least representative samples of reality. Importantly, those who do the selective reporting, whether large media corporations or amateurs with a cell phone, know their audiences. They know if their audience is more likely to be enraged by a cherry-picked image of police brutality or more likely to be enraged by a cherry-picked image of a mob attacking the police. They know which images their audiences will forward, post, and retweet. They purposely spread the fear, which is the moral equivalent of purposely spreading a virus, as fear is at least as contagious as any virus. I said earlier that the consequences of selective reporting can be far-reaching, and today's selective reporting may have the nation on the brink of civil war. I say may because it's difficult to know how volatile the nation actually is when the only data available are generated by selective reporting. And that is precisely my point. We have no window looking out at the world that provides a clear view of reality beyond our neighborhood. Instead, the screens at which we choose to gaze reveal only what others select to show us. My suggestions about what to do about the problems that I've mentioned are these. Parents are in the best position to teach resilience and strength to their children and to teach them how to resist efforts to instill a sense of victimization and danger where none exists. Parents are in the best position to teach their children the difference between common and rare. This is as simple as joining them in searching for a four-leaf clover and explaining that they're more likely to hear about a four-leaf clover than a three-leaf clover, because people like to talk about things that almost never happen. Parents are in the best position to attempt to control the screen time and screen content to which their children are exposed, and many good parents attempt that. All of us need to be cognizant of what the people behind our screens are trying to accomplish, whether that is to shape our purchases or donations, to bias us, to corrupt us, to mislead us, to shape our politics, or to make us afraid. They are not neutral, no matter what they say. All of us need to be thoughtful about what we read and what we watch. We have the power to choose whether we want to be enlightened, angered, biased, or afraid. Thanks for your attention.
Great, thank you very, very much. Jackie, would you like to step in? You are the moderator. Oh, we can't hear you.
There we can. Now you can hear me. Sorry. Thank you very much, Mr. Park, if I may call you that.
Sure.
That was really, really helpful. Our next presenter is Polly Weissner. She's already been introduced. She's from the Department of Anthropology, a distinguished professor at the University of Utah. Go ahead, Polly.
Okay, wait, I want to share my screen. Just 1 second. I'll figure this out. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, then the screen is going to be shared. And, okay, here. And then I need to go here. Yes, there we go, yay. Okay, so I'm going to speak about culturally constructed fears and violence. I have a lot of experience in this because I've worked for 40 years in two of the most radically different societies in the world, the Kung or Junhasi Bushmen of South Africa and the Enga of Highland Papua New Guinea. The Junhasi are perhaps the most peaceful group in the world, and the Enga one of the more warlike. Today I'm going to concentrate more on Papua New Guinea. So first of all, I think it's a good idea to get on the same base. What is culture? There are something like 500 definitions of culture in anthropology, but this one that I will use, it's a shared system of beliefs, norms, values, and practices that form an inherited lens for perceiving the world. This is very important. And learning how to behave in relation to others, including ancestors or spirit world. Features of culture are that it's shared, but it's not homogeneous. So on any cultural activity, there are different opinions, and that's what allows change to proceed. It occurs at many levels. It has family cultures, tribal cultures, national cultures, and it's inherited and passed on. These little kids here in Enga, they're learning to do a traditional dance, passing on their culture. No, okay. But also, it is contested and altered with new informations and channels of communication, so it's always changing. Here are some very aggressive guys on the right who are in an election campaign wanting to change the world. And modern technology speeds change because you have fewer community checks and balances. Usually if there's a new idea, it's kind of discussed, it takes some time to brew, but this can be almost instant. And new ideas are often integrated into old belief systems. You can see the picture on the left. This is a traditional dance, and someone has gotten a magazine picture and added this modern picture to his headdress. So who has culturally constructed fears? Do we have it? Who has them? So I took data from Bader et al., who studied fear in America, and summarized it on the left. And from where I work in Enga, I sent, my team has collected this data. And in the US, you know, you have real threats, but they're all culturally framed. And these are corrupt officials, terrorism, pollution, illness, economic collapse, natural disasters, crime, mass shootings. And in Enga, in Papua New Guinea, for the real threats that are culturally framed, you have a lot of payback murders, a lot of tribal fighting, used with guns like these fellows on the right, Chinese presence, illness and AIDS, crime, failure in education, economic concerns, accidents, and lots of domestic violence. The level of violence in New Guinea is just, it's really astounding. You wake up in the morning and something atrocious has happened. You kind of get addicted to your own chemicals and quite happy to come back to peacefully boring US. But the cultural constructs, do we have those? Yes, we have incredible ones like fear of vaccination, QAnon with Pizzagate, the global elite pedophiles. We have the G5 corona virus conspiracy theory, Islamophobia, beliefs in devils and demons, totalitarian world order, aliens. And in New Guinea, when I mention some of these to these, they say, yeah, you are pretty special people. And on the right are the ones of Enga, Sangoma witchcraft, fear of hell after death. The churches have made them really fear that hell is very real with its fires and so on. Ghosts, menstrual pollution, women can contaminate men, supernatural punishment, and the last one is addiction to Facebook. Facebook carries a lot of rumor that gets people off tracks, generates a lot of violence, and people are afraid of not being able to sort out what's true or not. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the most extreme Sangoma because it's also a problem we've been working with over the last years. The belief is it's new. It's a new introduction to the area where I work by people migrating in. Internet, people get on the internet and say, find Google witchcraft, they get Salem and they say, oh, they're doing this in America too. They have witches there. Facebook and texting, it's spread that way. The accusation is that the witch eats the heart of a family or community member. It's escalated through text messages, even in areas that had witchcraft in the past. It went by word of mouth and people would say, oh no, that person isn't a witch, and you know, so on, and it's mitigated. But when there are text messages, it goes out to 20, 20 send it out to 20, and pretty soon you have a mob. And for instance, this has shocked the world in 2013, front page of the New York Times, burning of Capri Lanita, who's from the area I work in, a 20-year-old mother as a witch in public. Why? Why do you have this? Probably for the same reasons we have some very strange conspiracy theories in our country. Rapid change, confusion, jealousy, economic inequalities, polygyny, jealous wives, lifestyle diseases. This is a big one. Before, people were fit, they didn't die in the middle of life. Now the richest people get very fat, suffer from hypertension, diabetes, and so on, and they drop dead, and people do not think that could be a natural illness. Scapegoating, and then crowd pressure. If you don't accuse her of being a witch, you may be with her. So I'll give you two stories. One very quickly is of a woman named Kathy. I know both of these women. And she was building a house in New Gardens on land that her father gave her. Her sisters, half-sisters, were jealous. There was a rumor, there was a big fish that was coming up for a feast from the coast. She asked them to keep a peace. They didn't. They feasted with a politician, a very prominent politician who was heavy, had respiratory problems, diabetes, and so on. The next day, he dropped dead. They said, because she didn't get the fish, a piece of the fish, she bewitched him. And they pursued her with guns. And they were going to kill her. And fortunately, she got into a house of a pastor I worked with, and we got her down to the police, who locked her up to protect her. And now we're trying to repatriate her into her community. The second one was a very sad one, Bami. It's a woman, a mother of 4, who was living in a household, and the man, the head of the household, dropped dead from a lifestyle disease. And she had been accused before of witchcraft. And so people hunted her down at night, and they brutally tortured and killed her. The community knew what was wrong. And so compensation was paid for her death, 17 pigs and about 10,000 US, a huge amount of money. But after that was paid, we went out and we interviewed people. Did they think that she was a danger to community? Still, 21 said yes, and only 14 said no. Is torture the best way to deal with subguma? 20 yes, 15 no. And other ways, counseling, church, 14, no other ways. So it's really a difficult problem because the community sees violence by sorcerers to be a problem to be overcome, while the law and NGOs sees violence by community against alleged sorcerers to be stopped. So you really have a difference here. And young men like this, they really will sacrifice their life to protect their communities. The belief is very deep. So it's witchcraft violence, it's epidemic in many parts of the world, not only in New Guinea. For instance, I'm sure you've heard about this in West Africa. It's estimated that 80,000 kids have been proclaimed as witches, driven from their homes by their parents, close relatives, and they survive. If they survive, they live as street children. In the Niger Delta, the Pentecostal movement, children are taken to churches. They're subject to inhumane torture, hacked with machetes, burned, poisoned, or expelled from home. Why? To explain the misfortune in this time of rapid change. Father loses a job, grandmother dies, sister gets AIDS, rapid economic development. It's a way of divorcing children, epidemics, poverty, social inequalities, greedy pastors, and Nollywood films. Nigeria has the 3rd biggest film industry in the world, and it dwells a lot on witchcraft. So there's 2 points I wanted to make here, is that fear overrides the most fundamental human bonds to spark extreme violence. You know, mother-child, the children are burning these witches, mothers are rejecting the children. And so the question one has to deal with is, how do you break the link between culturally constructed fears and violence? Sometimes it's hard to get rid of the fears, but you can try to break the link and make the outcome not be violence. So I don't know, in West Africa, they're doing a great deal. In the case where I work, we have a joint effort here. First of all, the criminal justice system has strengthened laws against people who do witch killings. However, young men don't care. They don't care if they go to jail for life. They're protecting community. And the other thing is the person, if she lives or he lives, they have to bring their relatives to court and put them in jail, which they won't do. So you can only get so far with criminal justice. Then we have customary courts and mediation, which make people pay large payments, and they're fairly successful because at least the people talk the matter through. Then you have medicine and science to explain to them that these lifestyle diseases are diseases and it's not witchcraft. But still, it's very, very hard to combat deep-seated spiritual and religious beliefs of the past with science. Making headway, but taking time. And then nonprofits and churches are doing incredible jobs. The Catholic Church has a 5-point program to, first of all, go right away to the trouble spot, to talk it through, to explain some of the science to people, to try to mitigate between Christianity and witchcraft beliefs. And mostly, they rescue these women, they take them away, they keep them away for months, and then they try to repatriate them in their communities. These women don't want to go elsewhere. The whole meaning of life, their kids, their friends, it's all at home. And then I have a program in the schools for cultural education. And in that, we not only present the science, but we also ask the young people, do you really want to grow up in a society where overnight people can turn on you and accuse you of being a witch and torture you with hot iron rods and kill you? And that seems to be making an impression well. So the whole idea is to break the link between fear and violence in very different ways. We all have to work together. The progress is slow because the change is so fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly.
Yeah.
And as people can hear, the strength of this forum is the interdisciplinarity from many different sides, looking at this, some of the same issues and how they relate to violence. Jennifer, you're up next.
Okay. Hi. So I'm Jennifer Massey. I'm an engagement writer at The Trace. And I'm here to talk about how fear of violence is related to gun ownership and gun violence. So 4 years ago, Harvard and Northeastern University published the results of a landmark survey of gun owners, the first of its kind in 2 decades. And it found that there was an estimated 265 million guns in civilian hands in the United States. That's more than the number of cars on the road. Civilians had added 73 million more guns to their collections since the last gun ownership survey in 1994. And 2/3 of those were handguns. Not long guns, which are typically used for hunting and recreation, but pistols, which are primarily used for self-defense. The most remarkable finding from that survey was 2 out of 3 respondents said self-defense was their primary reason for owning a firearm. Basically, fear of other people was now motivating the majority of gun buying in the United States. The last time a survey of this magnitude was conducted, most people said they own guns for hunting, collecting, or sport shooting. So this was a huge cultural shift. Now, in the 22 years between those surveys, violent crime dramatically decreased nationwide. But also during that time, the gun lobby, led by the National Rifle Association and aided by right-wing media, aggressively campaigned to lift restrictions against firearms in public and stoked fears of government gun seizures. There were 2 two-term Democratic presidents during that period, and nothing moves guns more effectively than telling gun owners the Democrats in the White House are going to take your guns. That messaging drove up sales. And with more guns in circulation, there were more shootings, most visibly high-profile rampage shootings. The firearms industry and retailers ramped up marketing of handguns for self-defense purposes, catering to this fear, and it fueled a handgun buying boom. What the gun lobby and manufacturers were capitalizing on was fear. One of the lead authors of the study, Deb Asriel at Harvard School of Public Health, told us, when I look at our survey, what I see is a population that is living in fear. They're buying handguns to protect themselves against bad guys. They store their guns ready to use because of bad guys, and they believe their guns will make them safer. But guns don't make people safer. Researchers have repeatedly found that having more guns around leads to more gun deaths. An unsecured loaded gun placed in a bedside table or under a pillow will more likely kill a family member than a home invader. But people have been told for years the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, and they believe it. Now, some fear is good. It's our way of deciphering threats. But fear can also be used to break someone down. It makes them susceptible and open to buying guns in this case. So fear becomes the norm, but it's not a sustainable way to live. What the Harvard and Northeastern study also found was that fewer Americans own guns than they did in 1994, but there are 73 million more guns. So how was that possible? The answer they found was that the people buying guns are buying more guns than ever before. Nearly 8 million people, or 3% of American adults, now own an average of 17 guns each. More guns are now concentrated in fewer hands. Those gun super owners are amassing handguns and they're buying them for self-defense. Fear of other people is the primary motivation for American gun ownership. This, despite the fact that study after study has shown that gun owners, particularly first-time buyers with little training, are much more likely to get shot accidentally or use guns in domestic violence incidents or arguments than shoot an intruder. It's much more likely their child will find it and shoot themselves or someone else. Incidents of civilian defensive gun use, like you see in the movies, are actually statistically rare. Fear has led these gun owners astray. It's much more reasonable to fear your child finding your gun than fearing a mass shooter you may never encounter. But fear overrides logic. The head of the NRA gave his good guy with a gun speech a week after the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. While the nation was still raw and grasping for solutions, and the NRA was tying tragedy to self-defense, and it worked. Gun sales spiked, and federal gun legislation tanked. Gun sales routinely spike after mass shootings. The solution the NRA offers isn't federal gun control, which is what works in other countries, but more guns, making every gun owner think they're the only person who can save helpless civilians in a Walmart. But the reality is most gun owners don't train to carry the firearms that they're stashing in their glove compartments and purses. In half the country, they're not even required to. So they're nothing like an action star crouching undetected in a parking garage, ready to neutralize the gunman. Because the gun lobby has spent years loosening both gun laws and training regulations, we now have millions of inexperienced gun users carrying weapons around in the supermarket, at the movie theater, even in church. In reality, mass shootings transpire so quickly that even trained gun owners sometimes decide against using them in the moment for fear of hitting civilians or being mistaken for the gunman and killed by police. This has happened several times over the past few years, mostly to Black gun carriers. Race figures into this in a major way. As a group, gun owners are disproportionately older, Republican, male, white, and rural. And they've been told that a quote unquote violent criminal thug is lying in wait for them, which is coded racial language. This conditioning has real world consequences. University of Illinois researchers found in 2015 that target shooters were more likely to shoot targets depicting Black people than targets depicting white people, whether the people on the targets were holding guns or not. Race influences split-second decisions. Defensive gun use is more often than not a split-second decision. Another thing the gun lobby doesn't tell gun owners is if they open fire in self-defense, particularly women who defend against abusers, there's a good chance they'll end up getting arrested. Some of the gun owners who shot suspected looters during this summer's civil unrest were arrested and charged with felonies. So pro-gun messaging employed by the gun rights movement, like don't be a sheepdog, refuse to be a victim, has a price that's not disclosed. But more guns is the only solution that the gun lobby and its GOP surrogates in Congress are offering. Even if Republican senators suddenly came to embrace gun reform, they're unlikely to vote in favor of it because they're gripped by fear, the fear of losing their jobs, because Second Amendment activists vote. Fear of other people also motivates illegal gun carrying in cities. In a 2018 survey by the Urban Institute, 93% of the men aged 18 to 26 who carried guns in violent Chicago neighborhoods said they did so for protection. Their sense of fear was rooted in real life experiences in crime-afflicted neighborhoods. One of them explained it this way: you become a different person when you have a gun. Somebody looks at you wrong, and because you have this gun, you have the power to flash it or shoot them. Of course, that just ratchets up the violence. Brandishing a gun is an escalation that, if both parties are armed, could easily lead to gunfire. That's true whether the gun in question is obtained legally or illegally. Fear also drives police shootings of civilians. As Derek Thompson pointed out in The Atlantic last month, America's culture of widespread gun ownership makes it all but inevitable that the United States has more armed police than similarly rich countries, more panicky officers, more adversarial police encounters, more officer shootings, and more civilian killings. Fear buying of guns has continued right up through this pandemic. Fears over the coronavirus, social unrest, and xenophobia have propelled gun demand to unprecedented levels. The FBI conducted 3.7 million background checks in March, the highest volume since the system began operating in 1998. But that record was shattered just 2 months later. In June, in the wake of widespread civil unrest sparked by the police killing of George Floyd, the FBI conducted 3.9 million gun background checks. Those buyers were conditioned by years of fear-based messaging. That messaging has been eagerly adopted by President Trump, who has a newish ad meant to sow fear around defunding the police, in which a 911 caller is told the estimated wait time to report a crime is 5 days. And voila, we have yet another way to push guns. See, police aren't going to help you. Defend yourself. So we have a situation in America where mass shootings beget more gun buying, which begets more gun violence. It's a vicious cycle. Our job here at The Trace is to report on this. So how can we deal in all of this bad news while not generating more fear without sounding like Fox News? What we try to do is identify a problem, but also provide a solution. We have the luxury of not needing to cover every story. We're a nonprofit digital news site. We're not a daily paper of record. So when we do choose stories, we choose an aspect of gun violence that someone is doing something to fix. Or we include context that demonstrates that it's not all doom and gloom. Yes, murder is up in 36 big cities so far this year over last year, but it's important to remember that crime is less than half of what it was in 1991. And while it persists in low-income communities of color, these are the reasons why, and here's what can be done, and here's someone who's doing something about it. It's not just drawing attention to a problem. It's drawing attention to solutions that can be attained with resources that are probably already available, but for political will. Another area in which we try not to spark more fear is our coverage of mass shootings. Public mass gun murder seize the public's attention, and for very good reason. You can't prepare for them. We've written several stories this year on how mass shootings are breaking records each month. There were 60 in May alone, the highest single month tally on record until June, when there were 95. Episodes of mass violence also point to the increased lethality of weapons in civilian hands, which is good information to report. If 34 people were shot in 6 minutes and 20 seconds with an AR-15, as was the case in Parkland, that might prompt community leaders and elected officials to advocate for policy changes, perhaps a cap on magazine capacity. So it's important to cover mass shootings. but not at the exclusion of everything else. Because mass shootings account for only 2% of annual gun deaths. And it's important to keep that in perspective. 60% of annual gun deaths in the United States are suicides, an aspect of gun violence that never gets enough attention. The rest are domestic violence, arguments, accidental shootings, and gun violence in Black and brown communities that persists partly because of systemic and structural inequities. So we always try to bring it back around to everyday gun violence because people are most likely to be shot by someone they know. But we're not trying to leave readers in a constant state of fear. We don't have to, we're not trying to sell them something. Anyone who has a Facebook account can probably tell you that nothing drives readership like outrage. And a lot of the things that we report evoke anger. But our goal is not to get readers angry and then just send them out into the world that way. We want to send them away concerned, perhaps, at the way things are, but also with a solution, a fix, understanding, and a sense of purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And our last speaker in this section is Professor Neville.
You're muted, Helen.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. Okay. Awesome. Thanks a lot for the invitation to talk to you. I've got 3 slides in 13 minutes, which I hopefully will be able to, let me just do this. I'm excited to share some of my ideas about this topic. It's a new topic for me in terms of thinking about violence in this area. Before I begin, I want to really, I want to start with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. And some of you might know that many people consider W.E.B. Du Bois as the father of scientific sociology in the United States. And this comes from one of his autobiographical works. So of course, he's writing also from at the turn of the century, 1900s, all the way up 1940s and 50s. He lived a long, long life. Anyway, he talked about one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. I really like this quote because it highlights the fact of our role as social scientists when so many awful things are happening around us, that we have a role to intervene and not to do it from a point of detachment. And so that's a little bit about my particular research. Today, my talk is really on colorblind racial ideology. That's what CBRI is, and the fear of Black people, or it could really be the fear of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I was asked to really talk and grapple with 2 questions. The first is, how is it my research related to fear of violence? And I really see that fear of violence is linked to the fear of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, primarily because some people view people of color, that they see them as representing a threat either to their personhood or a threat to society in terms of, so they represent a threat of violence. And then what happens is that folks use this perceived threat and use this fear to justify actions. And so I will unpack what that means. A lot of what I'm going to talk about picks up on some of the things that Jennifer Massia discussed in her discussion of gun violence. I'll end with thinking about what advice I might have for managing, reducing, and preventing the fear of racial violence. And this will be primarily based on my decades-long work of looking at training psychologists, teachers, but also my work in the past 7, 8 years with police recruits at the University of Illinois in their Police Training Institute. So for the past 2 decades, I've been really involved and interested in this concept of colorblind racial ideology. And my colleagues and I developed a scale, the Colorblind Racial Attitude Scale. So some of the research summary that I'll be talking about really is summarizing work that uses this scale, which is called the COBRAS, Colorblind Racial Attitude Scale. I start off with this kind of fun picture, images, because these images help us understand and unpack the diverse range or diverse perspectives of colorblindness. So there's varying definitions of colorblindness when it comes to race. A number of researchers, particularly in the field of psychology, view colorblindness as a perspective in which people ignore interracial divisions and they attempt to understand or view people or persons as individuals. And that would be captured by what Ruth Frankenberg talked about as this color evasion perspective. And so, you know, if you can see that, it says, when you choose not to see me or choose race, you choose not to see me. So the notion of I'm going to minimize there's actual racial differences. From this perspective, colorblindness is a sign of being fair-minded, committed to egalitarian principles. Thus, colorblindness is a strategy actually designed to reduce racial prejudice. It's important to realize that this is an aspirational goal of reducing racial prejudice and disparities that some people would say actually doesn't work, and I'd be one of those. Political scientist Amy Gutman, a decade and a half ago, she reminded us that ignoring race as a strategy to promote racial equality is desirable in an ideal world. But as we can tell from this particular moment, we're not living in an ideal world. We live in a world where there's incredible racial inequity and inequality. And it deals with overrepresentation of American Indians, Blacks, and Latinx people in prisons, among the poor, the un or underinsured, the underrepresented among home ownership and wealthy. We can go on and on to talk about the ways in which race actually does or color does matter. Additionally, there's mounting empirical evidence in the field that says that the adoption of colorblind perspective actually doesn't reduce disparities, but instead actually promotes inequality. The second component of colorblindness is really what I've been interested in, and this is this idea of power evasion. So I draw on the interdisciplinary literature of sociology, Black studies, legal scholars, and broaden this concept of the way psychologists have traditionally talked about it. And so from this framework, it's really looked at this dominant ideology that's used to deny, minimize, and distort the existence of racism. And that's really this notion of institutional racism. So I argue that this is denial or distortion of institutional racism is part of this larger cultural norm. And Eduardo Bonilla Silva has worked on this, and he's done a lot of articulating that as well. And what this does is when we say that racism doesn't exist, what that then does is it provides a framework to further justify inequalities that exist. So if you ask people, well, why is it that Blacks and Latinx folks don't own homes the same rate as white folks? And people might say, oh, they don't want to, they don't work as hard, they don't have the same jobs, and they don't look at the structural conditions that created that. Or you might ask them, well, why are there more, Black folks, why are they overrepresented in the prison system? Folks might erroneously say, oh, because they commit more crimes, etc. When we know that's not the case. Well, how is it that it's related, this colorblind racial ideology, how is that related to this fear of Black people? I'm going to really draw on some of the work of psychologist Lisa Spanierman We were colleagues for a bit at the University of Illinois. Now she's on faculty at the Arizona State University. She has a concept that she's been working with since about 2004, which is the psychological cost of racism to whites. And so she's not saying that white people experience the same consequences of racism as people of color. But what she does say is that racism also impacts white people. And one of the ways it impacts white people is what she calls this white fear or racial fear that deals with is irrational fear of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And there's lots of folks that talk about this irrational fear. Paul Kivel is one of them. And then what this does in terms of some people and some scholars have talked about, well, where is this coming from? How does it emerge? People talk about it emerging from segregation, lack of knowledge about race and racism, and it also is linked to their racial beliefs, which I would, really think about this. One racial belief is colorblind racial belief. And then the notion of what it looks like, she has a scale, the PCRW scale, and white fear is a piece of that scale. And it really deals with asking questions about being fearful of people of color, being distrustful of other races, and that some of this fear relates on an individual level, their own personal safety. And then there's this broader fear, this fear that people of color are going to take over, and then that white folks will be the minority. So there's that fear. And as Jennifer talked about before, this fear has real consequences. She talked about a study that was completed by scholars at the University of Illinois, some colleagues of mine, Yara McCowie and Carla Hunter and others. And what they did find is that when people have this fear measured by the PCRW white fear, that is actually linked to greater shooting bias. And she used an experimental design, and that's shooting bias against Black targets compared to whites and East Asians. We can then, extrapolate in terms of seeing that this bias is related to, could be related to the killing of Black folks, where we know that Black men are 2.5 times more likely, unarmed Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be shot and killed than are white men. With this image here, I just wanted to kind of talk then about this connection between colorblind racial ideology and white fear. Across a number of studies, Spanierman and other people have found that colorblind racial beliefs, in terms of that power evasion measured by the COBRAs, higher denial, distortion, minimization of racism is related to greater fear of people of color. And this is a study based on some data that Lisa and I collected in the Illinois Longitudinal Diversity Project. And she and Nathan Todd analyzed these data, and these were published in one of the Journal of Counseling Psychology. And essentially what this is telling you is we collected data with racially diverse groups of folks over at the beginning of the first year all the way to the end of the 4th year. These data come just from the white sample. And I highlighted that top line there. So to emphasize that those are high colorblind racial folks. So folks who are 2 standard deviations above the mean on that. And what we're finding is, as you can see, there's an association between greater denial and distortion of minimization of racism and more fear of people of color. But what's really interesting is that there is an upward trajectory between the beginning of their first year and the end of their first year. And so for some white students, this represented a moment in time in which they were confronted with a diverse situation. They came from rural areas. They were didn't have really sustained interactions with people of color. And now that they have these sustained interactions with people of color, and initially that leads to this increased fear. My sense is these sustained interactions really, at least those for the people who have the highest level of color blindness. And for those, my sense is these are individuals that are avoiding people of color, that aren't engaging meaningfully in people of color. And so it's important that we begin to think about what kind of exposure are people what kind of exposure is necessary to reduce this idea about white fear. And the data suggesting that it can't just be like 1 or 2 kind of exposures or lecture, that to get at this white fear, especially when it's rooted in this denial of racism, that is a longer term project and process. So I've got a couple of recommendations when we think about reducing white racial fear. I want to link that to increasing or challenging actually colorblind racial ideology and increasing a critical racial awareness. So what does that mean? It means providing people with an understanding that there is such a thing about structural racism that exists. And that structural racism accounts for all of these inequalities. And it's important to think about structural racism, not just here and now, but really tracing it back to its roots in the United States to help connect the dots for people. I'll give you an example. My partner is a historian, and he did recently a 3-hour lecture for Academics for Black Lives. And in this lecture, he traced white racial terrorism and violence all the way from the European slave trade to contemporary times. And he connected all of these dots. And participants were like, they were floored because they were unaware of these things. You'd be surprised about people in the US are unaware of basic things like redlining, the GI Bill, how the GI Bill created greater wealth for white folks because it allowed them opportunities to buy home and buy new homes, which then they were accumulate wealth, which Black GIs were really denied opportunities to buy homes in the same neighborhood. Like, people are completely unaware about these processes and how they work. And so it's important that we begin to increase that. And what we've found in our research is by increasing people's understanding and awareness about race and racism, we also increase their empathy for people of color and Black people in general, I mean specifically, and we also reduce this fear. So it's this idea that has to be an in-depth educational experience. I've been working with police officers, as I said, for the past 7 years, or police recruits, and what we've been doing is implementing a 10-hour Policing in a Multiracial Society project to help them understand race and racism, how it operates to reduce fear, as well as, and to increase empathy. And what we're finding is 10 hours is not enough. We need a lot more work in that. It needs to be like a semester-long kind of training experience. We're talking about a long-term endeavor because it took a lifetime of racial socialization for people to buy into those messages. As we know from the work that Alport did in the 50s, was really thinking about this contact hypothesis. We know that these meaningful opportunities for sustained interactions and friendships, cross-racial friendships, can be helpful in reducing fear. However, we also know that in order for those interactions, it can't be just at the superficial level, because we see if you have high colorblind beliefs and you have these superficial interactions, it's going to increase fear. But it has to be interactions that are based on egalitarian relationships, and has to be these deep friendships where we know people personally. My concern about that is that that is really important, but we must do that without sacrificing, people of color's well-being, because it can be incredibly taxing to always justify or be in the role of educating people. So that needs to be kind of worked out. We need to create these interactions and friendships that are mutually beneficial. And then we need to continue to evaluate the effectiveness of these interventions over time. I think that's what I have for folks.
Thank you very much. Fascinating presentations. And like I said, the forum's strength is around its interdisciplinarity. And we've gotten a number of questions from the panelists and from the general audience. So the first one is for Park Dietz, and if everybody on the panel just wants to turn on their camera and their microphone, Park, it looks like you're muted. So the question to you is there any evidence to suggest that countering these biased media messages with alternate messages is helpful? So in other words, if we can't get the media to message responsibly from the get-go, can we do anything to reduce the power of these biased messages?
The only thing that I'm aware of people trying to do as a kind of self-help or self-corrective move is to make sure to look at contrasting points of view by tuning into multiple networks, by looking for multiple sources. But I don't think that actually achieves the goal, because each of those sources is exhibiting its own brand of selection bias. None of them is telling us the truth about the world in a representative way. It's really about sampling bias. Normal, ordinary things aren't newsworthy. They're never going to capture the attention the way sensational and rare events do. And so we lose our ability to see what ordinary life is for masses of people, and instead get stuck looking at just the most extreme cases that don't represent the whole. That's my concern.
Yeah, and that's, and you mentioned some media guidelines that you had developed. Are those available somewhere?
I think they were actually incorporated in some YouTube video that made a sort of funny presentation showing that the media were doing the opposite of what I recommended. They were things like, don't include biographical information about the shooter, don't have bodies on the ground, don't show sirens and lights and blood, because those are the things that are emotionally arousing and that focus attention on the shooter himself, who shouldn't be the story. The story should be the harm done, the victims, not the bad guy. The less said about the bad guy in the moment, the better. There's time for that later.
Right. And one of our panelists said that the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention does have guidelines for media, at least on suicide reporting. And, you know, it does seem like there should be something similar for the mass shooting kinds of things, because I agree, it's oftentimes a suicide as much as it is, well, who knows? Those things are very complicated to sort out. Okay, so there was another question. Jennifer, this is for you. Is the, in terms of the crime rate, and, you know, especially recently, there's been a lot in the news about the crime rate going up. and whether or not, and also there's been more gun purchases at that same time. So are they always unrelated, or is it in part when crime rates do go up?
Well, crime, I mean, crime on the whole has gone down tremendously since the 90s.
Yeah, especially violent crime.
Yes, violent crime. But shootings persist in certain parts of our country. And what was the question again? Could you just, yeah.
Well, it was somewhat in terms of you were talking about that historical time.
Right.
And did the crimes, part of the question was, did the crimes against property and persons go up during that time?
So what we have actually, there were some preliminary numbers that came out just last week. Crime is up. The Upshot did an analysis. Murder is up 22% across 36 major cities. At the same time, crime in general is down, and that has only happened 4 times since the 60s. And it's pretty remarkable, like, how do you have that happen? You know, and that's definitely an area for, you know, future study, but it is rare, but it does happen. So we're actually in the middle of the strange statistical occurrence.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the public doesn't know what to make of those kinds of things, and whether or not they should be afraid for their own persons. And
they get used for political messaging, like, you know, a president will say crime is up, crime is terrible, crime is down, crime is way down. You know, it depends. You know, they'll pick and choose, they'll nitpick the stats or whatever, you know, bolsters their message.
Yeah, and length of time that they're looking at.
Right.
And up over what? In comparison to what?
Exactly. You know, it's not instructive really to compare year over year, because it's just, you know, we try to go for 5-year averages. But I think the question that really people want to know is, should I be afraid of gun violence? I mean, that sounds kind of like, you know, is crime going up? Is crime going down? Should I be afraid of gun violence?
Right.
You know, a lot of people, their introduction to gun violence is mass shootings. Those are statistically rare, even horrific as they are. Most people are shot by people they know. So, you know, people around domestic violence situations, you know, it's not like you can predict it. I've covered so many stories of murder-suicide where you trust the person with your life and then they take it. So how afraid should we be of gun violence? Well, you know, gun violence is still statistically rare. However, there have been studies like the effects ripple out into the community, where you have like half of people in this country know somebody who's been shot or know somebody who's been killed. So it's becoming less rare. About 120,000 people are shot in the country every year, and about 80,000 survive. So those are the stats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. And this is a question for Polly, for you. You spoke about how hard it is to fight emotions and culture with science. So for you, but also Helen, you may want to jump in here. How do we address the deeply emotional issues like gun ownership, racism, when science and emotional arguments might be rejected?
Yeah, well, you know, the thing is that science and religion deal with entirely different realms. One deals with morals and values and traditions, and the other with scientific fact. So until a population becomes well educated, it's very difficult. But even in our population, as we know, there are a lot of people who will reject climate change, who will reject vaccines, they'll reject science for a belief. And this is a very difficult thing. I think one of the things is not to polarize, to allow people to blend them. And that's a lot of what we do with the witchcraft, to try to blend traditional beliefs with science, with other things. Because as soon as you polarize, you're in trouble.
Yes. Helen, do you have
Sure.
a,
I really appreciate this question because we've given a lot of thought to this in our work with police recruits, as you can imagine. Like, for example, we would present data on racial inequality, and we would present census data about home ownership and inequality, and they would like, nope, we don't believe that. So they wouldn't believe the actual data we would actually present. That led us to begin to look at this idea about race-related motivated reasoning. In fact, working with a paper with a grad student who Mai Huang, who we developed a scale of race-related motivated reasoning just for this. And essentially what that is when people are presented with information that contradict their previously held belief, sometimes people have a strong affective response to that. And that strong affective response then prevents them from taking in new information. So it's like a hot cognition. It stimulates lots of affect and emotion. And so what they do is they become entrenched in their previously held assumptions. So we wanted to get a way to kind of measure that when it as it relates to race-related events. Now we have a measure of that, but some of my thinking along those lines based on my research and my work has to deal with just presenting people with cognitive information and facts is not going to work when there's people who are resistant. You have to kind of deal with the emotional pieces of it. You have to begin to think about how can we increase people's ethnocultural empathy so that they can take in, how to reduce their own defensiveness. And so those are things that I think researchers and educators need to begin to look at. And how is it that you can create learning environments where people can learn about race and racism without having that affective response? Because the affective responses come, they can come out of the blue. Another quick example, for example, after our educational trainings or workshops that we provide to police recruits, we ask them for feedback and, just to see how things are going. And on the very first one of the sessions, we offer three and a half hour sessions. And one of the first ones, we asked them to complete a cultural coat of arms when they themselves are talking about their own cultural socialization, great things about their culture. And one of the response was, I was trying to be open and receptive, but you had me when you shut me down when you said culture. So even the word itself can make people defensive. So we need to figure out a way to have people engage in the topic. So those are just some of my thoughts and responses there.
thank you very much. Park, this is another one for you. And we have a ton of good questions, so we'll get to as many as we can. But one of the questions one of our panelists had was in terms of you recommending that parents help children sort these things out. But what if parents don't have the skills or ability to differentiate what's happening in the media messaging?
Very, very difficult. I think ideally they would find someone who does have that skill and arrange for time for their children to spend with someone who can explain it better. And that could be a clergyman. It could be another parent that they've met. It could be a help giver in the community. It could be a teacher. But they need to be aware of the biases these people will bring to that discussion as well.
Yeah. Interesting. And I don't know, Polly, do you have in your work with some of the other societies in terms of helping parents navigate these waters?
Well, that's one of the things when you think about this in an evolutionary perspective. How did we ever survive all this fear and violence? Well, in the societies where I work, there is so much social support. There is so much ritual healing that takes place right away. And the kids grow up with this and they see it. So the fear is always mitigated by support and healing. And so you don't have to teach parents to do it. That's what happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just part of life.
Very, yeah, it's very something to go away with. And
Else we wouldn't have survived all these emotions we have in our evolution. I mean, a lot of them are positive only because they are then healed and dispelled by community.
yeah, and that goes back to the last session a little bit in terms of
Exactly. That's what I was thinking in the last section.
Yeah.
You know, other thing I want to add is that people in areas where I work with Christianity, they say the one thing that Christianity doesn't do is it doesn't explain misfortune. And if you say a 2-year-old dies and they say that's God's will, that doesn't do it for them. So today they're always looking for other explanations.
Okay. All right. A very different question, Jennifer. This one's for you. And there's a couple of pieces to it. So first of all, has the production of guns saturated the US market? And so that now the industry is turning its attention to selling guns to Mexico and beyond. And the other one, it was repeated twice. So that's the question.
Well, there can never be enough guns, but you know, in terms of saturating the U.S. market, so gun makers have to go elsewhere. I mean, guns are sold, you know, all over the world, but guns sold to legal owners on the border states, where there's little regulation, those are being smuggled to Mexico and Central America. And they're fueling the violence that refugees flock to the border to escape. So we have a situation in this country that's kind of almost of its own making. You know, we have a refugee crisis fueled by American guns, American gun perpetrated violence. So, you know, I mean, there's a market for American guns all over the world. There's a market for foreign guns here, but, you know, the lack of regulation in those border states has created a definite smuggling situation. And also the Trump administration has relaxed like regulations on exports of guns and just recently silencers. So there is a market for American guns all over the world. So, yeah.
Yes. All right. Helen, this is for you, and it's a rather different note. But in terms of, is the overrepresentation of Black persons in jail only the result of structural racism? Do we have good data? It's contemporary around, I mean, I think in my own world, in terms of domestic violence, that there is scattered evidence that Black men are held more accountable, are more likely to do jail time, etc. But that's really hard to unearth the actual data around that.
Yeah, interesting kind of question. I guess I'd like to even talk about the premise of the question, first of all, unless you're thinking that for some reason, so even if the disparities were not rooted in disparities in who gets arrested, disparities in who the sentencing, all of those factors that we know. I don't know the specific things around domestic violence, but I do know them around drug cases, gun carrying cases. We know that there's some differences there. But the very aspect of the question, unless you're prepared to say that Black men, that you think that race is biological first, when we know it's a social construct. And if you think it's race is biological, then you're saying that there's something biologically that Black men just biologically are committing more crimes. So that even if you buy into the notion that there isn't any disparities in the sentencing and arresting, the very fact that there's disproportionality suggests that there's something wrong with the system, unless you're prepared to say that there's something wrong with people biologically. Which that was the eugenics movement. That was, we got over that. So I think in terms of those, that's what I have to say to that question.
Thank you. All right, let's see. I have to go back to my chat thing.
Yeah.
Chat place. They come in fast and furiously.
It's hard.
I don't know if there's any other ones. Oh, I know. And this is also for you, Dr. Neville. Have your studies incorporated bias and non-bias of racism in general, as well as racism within cultures?
I'm not quite sure I follow that. Can you interpret that for me?
I just read it. So,
okay. So if the question has to do with, do I look at racial beliefs along with other forms of bias, I think what we have found is that higher levels of colorblind racial beliefs, we know that that is a different way of just saying that that's racism. It's a modern form of racism. We know it's related to racial prejudice. We know it's related to gender intolerance. We also know it's related to social dominance orientation, the belief that, you know, society is organized hierarchically and it should be organized hierarchically. And what we found is that colorblind racial beliefs are more important in understanding race-related behaviors and racist behavior than just thinking about general like social dominance orientation. So I'm not quite sure I answered the question, but that was my interpretation of the question.
It answered a really good question for me. So
Oh, okay.
unless we get another follow-up question on that. And the, I don't know, I think what we'll do is let each of you make a comment as a final putting things together from this session, because we're supposed to move at 4:30, so we've got like 2 more minutes. So each of you take 30, 40 seconds for one last comment. And Park, you were first speaker, so you get first up.
Well, I'd like to comment on 2 of the other things that were said. First, with respect to Dr. Neville, I think it's a false dichotomy that the higher concentration of people of color in prisons must either be due to structural inequality or biology. I think it's possible that it's due to culture, and that the important question is, are there aspects of African American culture that influence the outcome of prison or no prison by way of promoting increased opportunities to be arrested? In other words, there could be more crime because of features within the culture. I'm not saying there is, but it's just not a question of either biology or structural racism. And I'd also like to make a comment on Jennifer's presentation, and that's to suggest that it would be very interesting to look at the excess of shootings that have occurred recently, or if you choose, look at the shootings that occur in what you describe as predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, and determine one thing about the gun and one thing about the shooter. The thing about the gun that never gets reported is, were these lawfully purchased and possessed or not? The thing about the shooter that's never looked into is, was this person properly trained and a responsible gun handler, which is simple enough. And I think that the results of looking at that question might be eye-opening.
Okay, Polly, you're next speaker.
Yes, I'll just be very short. I just wanted to say that all cultures have culturally constructive narratives regarding fear. And our task, if we can't get rid of those, is to detach those from violence. Last night, I was talking to a colleague in New Guinea and told him about the anti-vaxxers in this country. And he said, you have people who reject vaccination. He couldn't believe it. You know, so I think one has to separate, to figure out the narratives that generate fear and then try to detach them from violence, even if you can't get rid of the narrative.
Okay. Jennifer.
My comment is kind of similar. You know, we've been inundated with messaging over decades that's the only thing that's going to save us from violence. We can eradicate all risk if we just buy a gun. But it's important to put it in perspective. We are a country of 330 million people. You know, the likelihood of getting shot is not high, except, you know, when you take away all of that fear-based messaging, you know, there is a way to accurately assess risk.
Yep.
You know, if you're in certain situations, you're more likely to get shot. And you need that clear-eyed assessment to really accurately, as opposed to, oh my God, the whole country's under siege, we're all gonna get shot, look at the mass shooting on TV. You know, and that's part of our job. You know, we're able to contextualize that. You know, there's certain pockets that are getting shot more often for certain reasons. So just really, you know, hitting them with facts to get through that messaging is what we aim to do.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Helen, you have the last word.
Okay, great. I guess some of the things that I want to say is that our beliefs about race and racism impact every aspect of our society and our interactions. It definitely impacts our fear of violence, particularly of violence of the other. But I would also encourage us as intellectuals and scholars to consider how our views about race and racism, particularly our awareness about racism, influence our scholarly work, our teachings, and our professional activities. That's it.
Yeah, I thank you very much for that. And I, Park, there was one of the things you said has generated a lot of reaction amongst the panelists. And, you know, I think, I'm not exactly sure how it was meant, but what I always think about in terms of the more arrests and the more incarceration of young Black men particularly, but also young Black women, is because of the over-policing. The things that they do because there's more police in their neighborhoods oftentimes gets them arrested. Doing something that a white suburban kid, exactly the same thing, would never get arrested for. You know, I don't want to leave us with that impression in terms of what you said. It's time for us to wrap up with our final session, and I'll hand it over to our fabulous our forum, this session of the forum, the Planning Committee. Emmy, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I think, and Corey, are you still on as well?
Yep, I sure
Oh,
am.
perfect. Well, I'll turn it to you first, yeah.
Yeah, and so thank you, Jackie, for a very thoughtful session. And the goal, I mean, we're trying to push the envelope here. We want to talk about things that are hard to talk about. We want to bring many perspectives into this conversation and really use the conversation to move positive progress forward in reducing the fear and the impact it has on our individual and collective health. So given that, Emmy and I are going to take just a moment to talk just quickly about some themes that we saw come up today, and then use those as ideas to move into our discussion tomorrow, and then Emmy will introduce tomorrow's session. And so I want to start in Dr. Leduc's comments about being very precise about what we are talking about, what we're measuring, what we're researching, but also how we disseminate that research is so important, because it's amazing we have such important national voices on the panel, but as our speakers. And so working to have some shared language is important, but I think what struck me more is the notion of how thoughtful we need to be in asking the right question for the right outcome and translating that to scientific audiences and non-scientific audiences in ways that that information can be meaningful and interpreted. So as a researcher, that really resonated with me. But also what resonated is how important it is to focus the basic research, integrate it with applied research, and it all needs to come together to really focus on what works. And we know very well from solving a lot of public health challenges that one thing is not going to work. And we need to move quickly into what do all the things we need to do at the same time work? How do we address individual fear and its biological outcomes at the childhood level, but also all the way into adulthood? And how do we move beyond working at the individual level to working at the population level and move all of that as upstream as we can, thinking about individual treatment and interactions, and then what we do in the systems where our vulnerable people, and we're all vulnerable people, but some certainly much more so than others, how do we get differentially at people who have a long history of different types of stress and trauma and fear built into our public health systems. So then thinking about tying back to all of the cultural interpretations and all of the different heterogeneities that we see and how fear impacts how we hear messages, how we react to messages, and how we talk about messages. I mean, I think it's going to get better over the next couple of days. I can't wait to talk more about this, but at the moment it feels so daunting to think about all the work we have to do just to understand the biological genetic mechanisms, and then how do we interact that with these many, many different cultural messages, both within our very diverse country and then within our even more diverse world. So there's so many layers of complexity that it feels scary and messy, but scary and messy is also usually really compelling in a place where there is huge difference to be made. So I'm moving in tomorrow, so excited to hear more because at the moment it is both daunting and fascinating. So Emmy, how about you?
Yeah, thank you. I share many of those same feelings. I keep reflecting on what Laura Rogers said at the very beginning, as I will say she frightened me with some of her anecdotes. But thinking about how fear can be so useful and fear of violence and fear of crime, thinking about how we protect each other, but that at the same time we really can't let it keep us from going, as she said, to keep us from going about our daily lives. And I think even more so, thinking about how we tackle these issues to hopefully make the world a little bit better, and that what feels daunting and what feels frightening, that's something that we as leaders, as professionals, really have I think an obligation to lean into. So exciting to hear what's happening in biology and our understanding of what's happening at the most basic level of humans, which, as discussed, is sort of like the biology that we all share, separate from those cultural and racial, sort of the cultural constructs of race. And thinking about the implications of that for both identifying people who might be at risk of the long-term negative consequences, but also interventions. And then this last session, and also left me with, I think, so many questions about how we tackle these very difficult issues, both at home and abroad, of culture and religion and deeply held emotional beliefs, and how can we talk about those in a rational and scientific way while being respectful of others, and that words matter. And I loved what Polly said about not polarizing and the importance of trying to avoid doing that. And I think I think today has left me with a lot to think about, but I'm really excited to return tomorrow to listen and learn and to show up with the courage, I think, to tackle some of these difficult issues. I do want to just point out to folks, over the next 2 days, we have ongoing discussions related to many of the issues that were brought up today around race, around policing, around gun ownership, as well as many of the other bigger issues. And so with that, I will say that tomorrow, day 2, is focusing on prevalent forms of violence and the fear that they create, but kind of diving into particular populations. So we'll be talking about vulnerable populations, including children, elders, and disabled individuals. We'll be talking more about racism and xenophobia, including from the perspective of people who may have understandable fears of the police as well as the police themselves. Fears of intrusion, continuing discussions around fears around active shooters and so forth. And then we'll be talking about sex and gender-based discrimination, including intimate partner violence. And I'll turn it, I will just say thank you to everyone for attending and for sticking it out, and turn it back over to Corey.
Yes, and I'm just going to close this up by saying thank you for all of the perspectives, and really hope we have everyone back tomorrow to continue.